Close your eyes and imagine stepping into the deep silence of a cave. The air is cool, still carrying the scent of earth untouched for tens of thousands of years. On the walls, red hands bloom like ghostly flowers, reaching toward us from a time when mammoths roamed and fire was our only sun. Tonight, on the History Sleep Channel, we journey back 40,000 years to listen to the whispers of our ancestors, the hunters, the dreamers, the children, who pressed their presence into stone so they would not be forgotten. These hands are not relics, they are invitations. And as we drift into their story, we discover that their voices, carried by pigment and silence, are also our own. The cave yawns before us like the open mouth of the earth, its lips rimmed with shadow, its breath cold and damp with secrets. To step inside is to abandon the light of the present and sink into a darkness that once wrapped itself around our ancestors. We imagine them moving slowly, torches sputtering, the red glow dancing over rock surfaces that had stood in silence for millennia before human hands transformed them into a canvas. And then, suddenly, there it is, a handprint. No elaborate scene, no recognizable figure at first glance, just the unmistakable outline of a human palm, fingers splayed, pressed into time. It is both startlingly intimate and impossibly distant. We feel that someone was here. Not a creature, not a ghost, but a human, breathing, watching, living 40,000 years ago. And somehow, through all that distance, they still reach for us. The handprints, most often made in red ochre, are deceptively simple. The pigment was ground from iron-rich earth, mixed with saliva or animal fat, and then blown over the hand pressed against the wall, leaving a negative stencil, a ghostly shadow of presence. In some caves, dozens cluster together, forming walls of hands, a chorus of gestures frozen in silence, each one slightly different, some large and wide, others small and delicate, suggesting women and children also left their mark. Their spread tells us they were not haphazard. There is rhythm and placement, as if they were composing a silent chant in pigment. Archaeologists often pause longest at these handprints, not because they are the most elaborate, but because they are the most human. The faces of our ancestors are gone, their voices dissolved into air, their bodies reduced to scattered bones. But here is the touch of their hands. If death consumed the flesh, the rock preserved the gesture. We might ask why they did this. Why waste precious time in an unforgiving world of cold and hunger to leave a mark that served no clear practical purpose? Some argue the handprints were signatures, declarations of identity, a way of saying, I was here in a world where the fragile body might not last. Others imagine rituals, initiations, moments when a child was brought into the deeper chambers to press their hand and join the continuity of the clan. Still, others suggest communication with spirits, a reaching into the stone to touch the other world. In truth, the answer is likely a weave of all these meanings and more threads of necessity, belief, and memory tied together in ways we can never fully reconstruct. The ambiguity itself is part of the power. We stand in front of the prints and feel that question open inside us. Why? The red hands invite comparison to the bones that sometimes accompany them. In a few chambers, fragments of skeletons have been found buried under layers of sediment, teeth and skull fragments preserved in mineral embrace. Just as the pigment clings to the wall, the earth clings to the body, sealing it against time. It is not too much to imagine that the people who made these prints knew that the body decays, but the mark endures. The fossil, the pigment, both outlast the flesh, and so the handprint becomes a kind of fossil of intention, a preservation of human will rather than human bone. The setting amplifies the effect. These handprints are not scattered across the landscape, not painted on exposed cliffs where weather and rain would erase them. They are hidden inside caves, in darkness where no sunlight reaches. To enter, one had to commit, to brave the silence, to trust the flicker of fire. Some of the stencils are positioned deep inside winding corridors, where even today one feels a shiver at the enclosing rock. The act of placing the hand there was not casual. It required time, risk, and perhaps courage. This was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The cave itself becomes part of the artwork, a womb of stone cradling the handprints like unborn messages. We imagine the moment. A hunter returns, body sore from the chase. The air outside is sharp with winter, meat scarce, the cold unrelenting. Inside the cave, fire crackles faintly, shadows stretch along the walls. A figure presses their hand to the wall, another blows pigment through a hollow bone tube, ochre dust filling the air, settling on the skin, staining the lips. When the hand is removed, the outline remains. In that instant, the present fractures. A gesture meant for eyes that will never meet theirs. A message drifting forward into the dark river of time. Perhaps the child laughs at the sight of their own small hand made large in color. Perhaps the elder murmurs a prayer. Perhaps silence fills the space, each person watching the image form and realizing they have stepped, however briefly, outside the flow of mortality. Modern forensics remind us how much can be read from a trace. The width of fingers, the spread of the palm, even the angle of the wrist can hint at age, gender, sometimes even handedness. When archaeologists apply similar methods, they find that many of the cave handprints belong to women and adolescents. This complicates the older image of cave artists as male hunters retreating to paint heroic scenes. Instead, it suggests communal acts, whole families entering these spaces, leaving their mark in shared ritual. The wall of hands becomes not only a gallery, but a gathering, a record of presence across generations. Some prints overlap, one hand covering another, perhaps years or even centuries apart. A living palimpsest of touch, and then there is the color itself. Red. It is no coincidence. Red ochre is one of the oldest pigments known, used not only in cave art, but also sprinkled on burials as if to return the dead to the warmth of blood. Its vibrancy outlasts millennia. When researchers uncover ochre-stained tools or bones, they marvel at how the color still clings, as if refusing to fade. To paint in red was to choose life, vitality, danger, and endurance all at once. The first red marks were not only signs, but symbols, communicating more than they could ever speak aloud. It is striking that across continents, cultures that never touched still chose red ochre as their medium, as though humanity itself shared an instinct for that color. An ancient chord struck across the species. The silence of the caves amplifies imagination. Stand before those hands today, and you hear nothing but dripping water, the hush of your own breath. Yet once, perhaps, these chambers resonated with voices, with chants, with the shuffle of feet and the crack of fire. The prints are the echo, the residue of sound and movement long gone. They draw us into a kind of time travel. We are not only looking at the past is looking at us. Each hand, frozen in pigment, becomes a gaze turned outward. It says, "Remember us." It says, "We were here." It says, "You too will pass, but perhaps you too can leave a mark." In the end, what grips us most is not the mystery of their meaning, but the intimacy of their presence. We do not need to know whether the prints were magical charms or children's play, funerary rites or acts of identity. We simply need to recognize that they were made by beings like us, hands of skin and bone, reaching out in the dark. That recognition is enough to collapse the abyss of time into a single breath. We place our hand over theirs, not touching, only hovering, and feel the strange warmth of connection. 40,000 years dissolve. The cave grows quiet. And in that silence, we realize the first red marks were not left only for their world, but for ours, an unbroken bridge across the ages. The cave is not only a place of marks, but of silence. When you step deeper, beyond the entrance where faint daylight can still reach, the air changes. It thickens, holding the weight of darkness, pressing against the ears until every sound seems magnified. Your breath, your footsteps, the small crack of a pebble underfoot. Each echoes as though the stone itself is listening. Our ancestors knew this silence. They must have paused, their torches flickering, their hearts quickening at the realization that the world outside, the wind, the cries of animals, the flowing rivers, had all been cut off. Here, within these walls, there was no horizon, no stars, no sky. Only the stone, vast and indifferent, and the silence that swallowed every word. It is in such places that meaning deepens, because the ordinary world is left behind. The walls themselves, blank stretches of pale stone, were canvases waiting for stories. Before the handprints, before the animals, there was the silence of untouched rock. To enter a chamber and see nothing but the unbroken wall must have been overwhelming, like standing before a vast sea of potential. Archaeologists describe the natural contours of the rock, the way shadows gather in its curves, the faint shimmer of minerals in torchlight. These surfaces were not neutral. They suggested forms, invited imagination. To the people who entered, they might have seemed like sleeping spirits, faces waiting to emerge, whispers etched in silence. And when the first marks appeared, whether a hand, a line, or the outline of a beast, it was as if the silence itself had been broken, turned into memory and meaning. This silence is not emptiness, but presence. In modern excavations, when researchers map cave acoustics, they find that certain chambers resonate differently. A voice or drumbeat in one spot carries powerfully, while in another it fades into nothing. It is no coincidence that many handprints and paintings appear precisely in these resonant chambers. The silence was not merely absence of sound, but a stage for it, a container that could magnify chant, rhythm, and breath. The walls held not only images but echoes. To paint on them was to inscribe both sight and sound into the same sacred space. Perhaps that is why so many marks cluster together, as if forming a chorus that could be heard as well as seen. The wall of silence was, in truth, a wall of voices. When we look at the placement of certain prints, high above, near ceilings or deep recesses, it is hard not to imagine the ritual of making them. Someone had to climb or be lifted. Someone had to prepare the ochre, grind it, blow it through a bone tube. In that moment, silence would have been broken by the rasp of breath, the rush of powder, the cough of dust filling the throat. And then, silence again, as the hand was pulled away, and the group beheld the new mark glowing red in firelight. The moment is both theatrical and hushed, as though silence was as much a participant as any human. We find ourselves comparing this silence to burial grounds unearthed in other regions, where bodies were laid to rest in caves and left undisturbed for millennia. There, too, silence ruled. When excavators uncover bones curled in fetal positions, coated in ochre or wrapped in animal skins, they often remark on the stillness of the site, the sense that they are intruding on an unbroken slumber. The caves were not only studios of art, but also chambers of memory, places where the living confronted the weight of death and the enduring silence it brings. To press a hand on the wall was not unlike lowering a body into earth. Both acts sought to leave something permanent in the face of vanishing life. The deeper one goes, the more profound this silence becomes. Imagine carrying a flame into the farthest galleries, where the walls close in and the air grows thin. Every breath consumes oxygen that is not easily replaced. To linger is to risk suffocation, dizziness, collapse. Yet marks appear even there. Why would they go so deep, into spaces so hostile to life? One explanation is that the silence itself was the point. In the outer world, sound is constant, unmanageable, a chaos of weather and beasts. In here, silence was total, absolute. To reach the innermost chambers was to enter another realm, one not meant for daily life, but for transformation. It was the silence of the underworld, and painting within it was a way of touching powers beyond the ordinary. We know from forensic studies that traces of torch soot remain on cave ceilings, thin black streaks frozen into the stone. These reveal the paths of ancient firelight, flickers of movement recorded like shadows. Some streaks appear over prints and paintings, suggesting that people returned, generation after generation, bringing fresh fire into the same silence. The caves were not abandoned after a single ritual. They were revisited, renewed, re-entered. Each return meant silence broken again, then restored. It is almost like the rhythm of breath itself. Inhale, exhale, quiet in between. The effect on us today is hard to describe. Modern visitors are often struck not just by the images, but by the silence in which they reside. You stand before a wall of hands or animals and realize you cannot speak without disturbing something sacred. The silence feels alive, protective, as though it belongs more to the ancestors than to us. Some archaeologists describe moments when their tools fell silent, when teams paused in their work because the atmosphere pressed too heavily. They were no longer simply researchers, but guests in a space still owned by the past. The silence demanded respect, and so the wall of silence is not a void. It is a mirror, reflecting back our own sense of smallness and our yearning to connect. It forces us to listen inward, to confront the passage of time and the brevity of our own voices. The handprints gain their power precisely because they emerge from this silence. Without the hush of stone and shadow, they might be simple graffiti. With it, they become testimony, whispers across millennia. We are reminded that the past is not just made of bones and pigments, but of spaces, of atmospheres, of silences that carried as much meaning as any spoken word. The people who placed their hands here gave shape to silence, and in doing so, gave us a chance to hear them still. The fire is burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the darkness, and in that dim circle of warmth, the outlines of life and death blur together. For our ancestors, survival was not an abstract concept, but a daily negotiation with hunger, cold, and the fragile barrier that separates breath from silence. The caves preserve more than art. They preserve traces of existence, fragments of ash and bone that speak quietly of how people lived and how they died. To kneel beside the blackened remains of a hearth is to imagine the crackle of fire that once roared there, to smell roasted meat, to feel the heat against frostbitten skin. To stand over a scatter of bones is to realize that meals ended here too, with marrow cracked from the long bones of animals, with teeth gnawing the last shreds of flesh in a season when nothing else could be found. Ash and bone, together they form the residue of life, the twin witnesses of sustenance and mortality. Caves across Europe and Asia contain layers of charcoal, hearths carefully rebuilt over centuries. In some sites, archaeologists have uncovered stratified fire pits, one laid upon another, like the pages of a book, each layer recording a night of warmth and storytelling. The ashes are delicate, but under certain conditions, they fossilize into hardened bands that can be analyzed thousands of years later. Within them, traces of plant matter remain, fragments of wood, even chemical signatures of the species burned. Through these details, modern science reconstructs what kinds of forests surrounded the people, what they chose to carry into the depths, and how they managed fuel in an environment where every stick mattered. The fire was more than comfort, it was survival. It drove away predators, dried damp hides, and hardened wooden spear tips. But it was also a gathering point, the heart of human community. To imagine people sitting in its glow, shadows flickering against painted walls, is to understand that the cave was not only a refuge, but also a stage where life's dramas played out. And yet alongside the ash lie bones, stark reminders of death. Some belong to animals, split open for marrow, or gnawed by human teeth, scattered carelessly on the floor before being sealed by sediment. Others belong to humans themselves, preserved with a strange tenderness. In certain caves, skeletal fragments appear deliberately arranged, skulls positioned apart from bodies, stones placed around them. One can sense ritual here, a respect for the dead that goes beyond disposal. Sometimes ochre dust coats the bones, that same red pigment used for handprints, as though to color the dead in the same shade of life. Such discoveries unsettle us, for they blur the line between the practical and the sacred, between nourishment and remembrance. A long bone could be cracked for marrow one day and painted in ochre the next, each act equally vital to survival in its own way. The conditions of the cave, dark and stable, sometimes preserve human remains in ways both haunting and miraculous. Skulls found sealed in calcite, teeth encased in mineral deposits, children's bones cradled in stone, as if the cave itself had chosen to protect them. Archaeologists approach these finds with reverence, for they are not only evidence of lives lost, but also of how those lives were mourned. One burial in particular, discovered beneath layers of collapsed rock, revealed a child interred with animal bones, tools, and traces of red ochre, a small ceremony frozen in time. The body is long gone, but the arrangement speaks of a community that could not let death pass unmarked. In that act, we glimpse an early form of humanity's struggle against oblivion, the refusal to let silence swallow memory. The bones also carry another story, written in fractures, cuts, and scars. Modern forensic methods applied to ancient skeletons reveal a catalog of injuries and illnesses. Healed fractures suggest care, individuals surviving long after wounds that would have been fatal without assistance. Worn joints speak of endless walking, relentless labor. Cuts on bone surfaces, sharp and deliberate, sometimes whisper of violence. Human against human, perhaps raids or disputes. Moments when hunger or fear outweighed kinship. Other cuts are more ambiguous, aligned with disarticulation marks found on animal carcasses. Were these acts of ritual defleshing, or something darker, cannibalism driven by desperation? Archaeologists debate fiercely, yet the bones keep their silence, leaving us with fragments of possibility. Still, even these grim traces remind us of resilience. To survive in a world of predators and ice required endurance not only of body, but of spirit. Amidst the evidence of death, there are also signs of life enduring. A skull showing signs of trepanation, a hole deliberately cut into the bone, suggests attempts at healing, perhaps rituals to release illness or spirits. Remarkably, in some cases, the bone shows signs of regrowth, meaning the individual survived the procedure. This convergence of medicine and ritual reveals a people grappling with suffering in ways not unlike our own, blending hope, belief, in a crude but courageous form of surgery. In the faint grooves of bone, we glimpse hands that once held stone tools with precision, guided by intentions that echo our modern doctors. Though separated by tens of millennia, the bones of animals speak too. Aurochs, bison, horses, mammoths, all their remains have been found mingled with human traces. Some bones bear patterns of cut marks that suggest systematic butchery, the stripping of meat and the breaking of marrow. Others, however, show signs of reverence. Skulls placed upright, horns arranged as if for display. One cave chamber held a circle of bear skulls, carefully positioned as though watching. Was this reverence, worship, or simply storage? We cannot know, but we feel the pull of mystery. Just as the paintings elevate animals into the realm of symbols, so too do these bones suggest that death itself was never only practical. To survive required meat, but to live required meaning, and the two were never entirely separate. The ash and the bone are, in the end, inseparable. Fire consumes flesh, leaving bone behind. Bone returns to dust, leaving minerals and ash. Both testify to the same cycle: life devoured by hunger, death transformed into sustenance, memory preserved in pigment and stone. For our ancestors, this cycle must have been palpable. Each hunt ended in fire and feast. Each feast left bones, and each bone reminded them of their own fragility. Perhaps that is why they painted, why they pressed hands onto walls. In the face of ash and bone, they sought to declare something more enduring, something that would not crumble into dust. The prints and images were not escapes from mortality, but responses to it, affirmations carved against the silence of time. When we stand in such caves today, looking at layers of ash compressed underfoot, we are reminded that these traces are fossils of ordinary life. Not every artifact is grand. Sometimes the most moving are the humblest. A footprint pressed into clay, a charred seed, a fragment of jaw with worn teeth. They are the archaeology of dailiness, the material of survival. And yet, woven together, they tell the story of humanity's earliest stage plays, the drama of fire and hunger, of life flickering against the cold. In every ember and bone, we glimpse the persistence of spirit, the refusal to let existence vanish without record. The cave becomes a theater of mortality, and the audience is us, ash and bone. They are the chorus beneath the paintings, the silent testimony that makes the art possible. Without fire, no gathering. Without death, no memory. Without bone, no reminder of fragility. When the red hands bloom on the walls, they do so against the backdrop of these remnants. To look at the art is to stand upon a floor built of ash and bone, a floor that whispers the cost of survival. And in listening, we come closer to the people who thousands of years ago kindled their fires, mourned their dead, cracked bones for marrow, and still found the strength to press their hands against the stone in defiance of time. They moved in silence, their bodies bent low against the wind, their spears balanced on shoulders hardened by cold. The world outside the caves was an open plain of ice and scrub, treeless and vast, where every shadow might be prey or predator. To survive, they had to hunt, and the hunt was no simple task. The auroch stood taller than any man, its horns sharp crescents capable of goring a hunter in an instant. The woolly rhinoceros was an armored fortress of flesh, charging blindly, but with a force that could shatter bone. Even the wild horses, herding in groups, could trample a lone hunter beneath pounding hooves. Yet these were the creatures that filled the cave walls, their forms outlined in red and black, their power captured in sweeping lines of pigment. To paint them was to summon them, but to kill them was to live another day. Between image and action, art and necessity stretched the thin line of survival. The hunters would have tracked their prey by signs invisible to us. A tuft of hair caught on a branch, a trail of droppings half hidden under snow, the faint imprint of hooves pressed into frozen ground. Their eyes were sharpened by hunger, able to read landscapes like a living book. Sometimes they followed herds for days, waiting for the moment when an animal lagged behind or strayed from the group. Sometimes they drove them toward cliffs or bogs, turning terrain into weapon. And when the moment came, they attacked as a group, spears whistling through the air, shouts and drum beats echoing across the plain. It was dangerous beyond measure. Many must have fallen to horns and tusks, their bodies broken and left behind. But those who succeeded carried back meat and bone enough to feed the clan, and firelight would once again flicker on painted walls. Archaeological digs reveal the scale of these struggles. At certain sites, immense accumulations of animal bones lie buried, suggesting mass hunts where dozens of beasts were brought down together. In one valley, the fossilized remains of mammoths lie in clusters, their tusks tangled, their rib cages collapsed into the earth. Cut marks on the bones tell the story, knives stripping flesh, stone blades cleaving tendons. Nearby, the remains of hearths, tools, and broken spears bear witness to feasts that followed. One can almost hear the exhalations of relief, the laughter of children tasting marrow, the stories retold in the glow of flames. Yet among those bones are also human fragments, fractured skulls, splintered femurs, silent reminders that the hunters were sometimes hunted themselves by beasts, by rival clans, by the cold itself. The caves preserve not only art, but also echoes of the hunt. Images of bison with arrows piercing their sides, horses painted mid-gallop, stags with antlers sprawling across entire walls. The painters did not choose their subjects at random. They painted the animals most vital to survival, the creatures that filled bellies and hides. Yet they did not paint them weak or pitiful. Instead, they painted them powerful, surging, commanding. It is as though to depict them was not merely to celebrate the kill, but to honor the strength of the hunted. Some researchers argue that these paintings were charms, magic meant to ensure success, to trap the spirit of the beast before the body was taken. Others see them as memories, records of hunts gone by. Whatever the intent, The effect is undeniable. The hunt is eternal, replayed again and again across stone walls. Its drama carried into every future generation that entered those caves. One can imagine the duality of emotion the hunters felt: terror and awe, dread and reverence. To face a cave lion was to face death itself. Jaws wide enough to crush a skull, claws sharper than knives. Yet the lion appears again and again in paintings, often larger than the human figures around it. To draw its image was to acknowledge its dominion, to place it in the pantheon of beings that ruled the Ice Age world. The bones of lions have been found too. Massive jaws, teeth worn by use, skeletons preserved by chance beneath sediment. In some places, puncture marks in human bones match the spacing of lion fangs, grim evidence of encounters where the hunters became prey. Such finds give us pause, reminding us that these painted animals were not distant subjects, but immediate, lethal presences in daily life. The methods of the hunt have left their traces. Spears hardened by fire, flint points chipped with precision, scrapers and knives litter the archaeological record. Some spears, miraculously preserved in bogs, show the careful shaping of wood, straightened by fire and polished by hand. When examined, they reveal balance and aerodynamic skill, proof that these were not crude tools, but finely tuned weapons, crafted with knowledge honed over generations. Experiments with replicas show that such spears could pierce the hide of a mammoth if thrown with enough force, embedding deep into muscle. The hunters knew their craft well, but each attempt still carried mortal risk. That risk is written in the injuries recorded in ancient skeletons: fractured ribs, dislocated shoulders, spear wounds that never fully healed. Each scar is a chapter in the story of the hunt. Yet the hunt was not only blood and struggle, it was also ritual, bound by belief. In some caves, animal bones are arranged in deliberate patterns, as though offerings to the spirit of the slain. In others, hoof prints fossilized in mud suggest animals driven into chambers before being killed, the hunt itself entering the sacred space of the cave. These intersections blur the line between survival and ceremony, between flesh and spirit. Perhaps the hunters believed that painting the animal's form would honor its sacrifice, appease its spirit, or ensure its rebirth in the herds outside. In this way, every hunt was a dialogue, not only between predator and prey, but between human and world, body and spirit. Firelight must have amplified the drama. Imagine the hunters returning, exhausted, triumphant, or defeated, and gathering in the cave. As flames flickered, the painted animals seemed to move, their hooves stamping, their horns twisting, their eyes flashing. Shadows made them gallop, made them charge. The hunters would tell the story of the day's pursuit, their voices rising against the roar of the fire, their gestures casting shadows that merged with the painted beasts. Children would listen wide-eyed, women would murmur prayers, elders would nod with recognition. The cave became not only a sanctuary, but a theater, where survival was transformed into myth. The hunters became heroes, the slain animals became legends, and the silence of stone became alive with performance. Today, when archaeologists uncover kill sites, piles of bones with cut marks, weapons scattered among them, they often speak of the visceral connection between those finds and the painted walls. The two are not separate, but parts of the same whole: the hunt in life and the hunt in art. The bones tell us what was eaten, the paintings tell us what was remembered. Together, They create a tapestry of survival woven from ash, pigment, and blood. And as we gaze upon the galloping horses, the charging bison, the prowling lions, we realize that the hunters carried their world with them, etched it into stone, so that long after the animals themselves had vanished into extinction, their power would endure. The hunt defined them. It was the measure of courage, the bond of community, the rhythm of existence. To hunt was to risk death every time, but also to affirm life. To paint the hunted was to recognize their majesty, to declare that survival was not only consumption, but also respect. The hunters in the dark were not mindless killers, but participants in a vast and fragile balance, one that demanded both reverence and blood. When they pressed their hands against the stone, when they drew the curve of a horn or the flank of a horse, they were inscribing not just images, but experiences, memories of moments when life and death clashed on the icy plains. And in those inscriptions, they left us not just evidence of their survival, but testimony of their spirit. The fire was never merely a tool. To our ancestors, it was a presence, a force that transformed caves into living spaces of light and shadow. In the deep chambers where no sun had ever entered, fire became both sun and star, casting trembling beams against walls, animating the images painted there. The hunters could not have known it in scientific terms, but they knew its magic. The way flickering light gave motion to still forms. The way darkness beyond the flames seemed to pulse with unseen figures. Sitting by the blaze, wrapped in skins, their faces aglow with shifting light, they must have felt as though they were living within the beating heart of the world. Fire fed their bodies, but it also fed their imagination. Ashes uncovered in the recesses of caves are not random. In some places, hearths appear exactly beneath clusters of paintings, as though positioned to maximize the spectacle. When torches were set against the walls, the pigments glowed, shadows moved, and animals appeared to leap. A bison painted with its legs bent seemed to gallop as the flames wavered. A horse's mane seemed to ripple. A deer's antlers stretched higher with each flicker. Archaeologists who have tried to recreate these moments describe a kind of proto-cinema, an illusion of motion produced not by technology, but by fire. The caves, then, were not galleries, but theaters, and the fire was the projector. To sit in such a performance was not passive watching, but a communal event, a shared act of wonder in which art, light, and imagination fused. One can imagine the roles unfolding around the fire. Perhaps there was a storyteller, an elder with a voice low and resonant, who retold the day's hunt or a memory of seasons long past. Perhaps there was a singer, or several, beating on hollow logs or bones to create rhythm that carried into the stone. The firelight would have cast their shadows high onto the walls, blending human forms with painted beasts, making the hunters themselves part of the performance. Children would have stared, half frightened and half entranced, as the shadows of their parents became lions, bison, or spirits dancing in the flame. The cave in that moment was alive with transformation. Every flicker of fire a brushstroke of living art. Fire also held danger, and perhaps that was part of its awe. The caves bear marks of soot, blackened ceilings, streaks of smoke that seeped into the pores of stone. To burn fire inside was to gamble with air, to consume oxygen in spaces where fresh breath was scarce. Some chambers hold evidence of sudden collapse, where fires burned too hot or too long, where ceilings cracked from heat stress, The hunters risked not only suffocation, but entombment, and yet they returned again and again, lighting flames in the same places, choosing to accept the risk in exchange for the visions fire could conjure. In this way, fire was both friend and threat, a dual force that echoed the balance of life outside. Giver of warmth, taker of breath, a spirit to be honored as much as used. When modern researchers explore these caves, they often find fragments of torches discarded in corners, lengths of pine wood charred at the tips, some bearing fingerprints pressed into soft resin before burning. These fragments are small but intimate, the mark of a hand shaping wood, the knowledge of which tree to choose, the memory of how long each stick might burn. To hold such a fragment today is to hold the remains of a journey, a moment when someone ventured into the dark, trusting only in firelight to guide them. The torch became both tool and companion, its smoke curling, its flame sputtering, its light shrinking the immensity of the cave to a trembling circle. Without fire, the depths were inaccessible. With fire, the walls themselves awakened. The shadows fire produced were not neutral. They created patterns that invited interpretation. The natural contours of rock could suddenly resemble faces, spirits, creatures half hidden. A bulge in the wall might seem like a bison's shoulder. A crack might suggest a serpent coiling. When painted and illuminated, these features became uncanny, alive. The artists, it seems, chose locations not only for their flatness, but for their potential to transform under firelight. To paint a horse on a bulging surface meant that, under torchlight, the horse seemed to move. To place handprints in recesses meant they appeared and disappeared as the flame shifted. Fire was not merely a background condition. It was part of the art, a collaborator that animated the visions. The shadows completed the paintings, filling them with a vitality the pigment alone could not supply. In this light, the caves become places of performance as much as preservation. Some archaeologists suggest they were sites of initiation, where young members of the clan were led into the depths, seated before the fire, and shown the visions on the walls. In that trembling light, they would feel fear, awe, and belonging, all woven together. The fire and shadows were not only spectacle, but pedagogy, teaching the young what animals mattered, what spirits guided them, what dangers lurked. To grow up in such a theater was to be formed not only by daily survival, but by nightly visions, a cycle of education carried through art and flame. If this was the case, then fire shaped culture itself, transmitting knowledge across generations not only in words, but in light and shadow. Even in death, fire played its role. Some burials bear traces of burning, as though flames were part of farewell rituals. Charred bones found near ochre-stained burials suggest ceremonies that mingled light with silence. The cave itself, already a place of shadows, became an underworld lit by flame. To lower a body into such a space and then to kindle fire was to symbolically guide the dead, to give them light for their journey. Archaeology offers us these glimpses and fragments: scorched stone, calcined bone, soot frozen in mineral deposits. They are small, but together they form a portrait of fire as central to human existence, not only in life, but in death, not only in function, but in meaning. Modern visitors who have seen reconstructions of these fire-lit scenes describe feelings of astonishment, even vertigo. To stand in a cave with flickering light, to watch painted animals leap and shimmer, is to feel as though time collapses. One becomes participant rather than observer, caught in the same drama that captivated our ancestors. The shadows draw you in, make you part of the story. You see your own silhouette blend with the ancient figures, and you realize that this is not merely their theater, it is ours as well. The fire binds us to them across 40 millennia, the same light dancing in our eyes as in theirs. And so, firelight and shadows remind us that art was never static, never silent. It lived in performance, in movement, in the fragile dance between light and dark. The caves were not cold museums, but vibrant stages, where life's fiercest struggles and most delicate hopes were enacted nightly. The hunters brought back meat from the plains, but they also brought back stories, visions, and myths that required fire to reveal. Around the flames, they became more than survivors. They became storytellers, dreamers, artists. In the trembling glow, their world took shape, and in that shape, they found meaning strong enough to carry through ages of hunger, ice, and death. Fire was their companion, their danger, their muse. And in the silence after the flames died down, when only shadows remained, the stories lingered still, written not only on walls, but in memory, echoing long after the last ember cooled. Inside the caves, silence is never absolute. A whisper can travel farther than expected. A footstep can return like the tread of another. The rock itself answers, shaping each sound into something larger than the voice that made it. Our ancestors must have known this intimately. Imagine them pausing in the dark, a child calling out, only to hear their own voice come back strange, multiplied, transformed. In such moments, the cave revealed itself not only as a shelter, but as an instrument, a body of stone that could sing. The echoes were not empty. They carried power, suggestion, mystery. To live in a world where the unseen was always close, the return of sound must have felt like a spirit speaking back. Modern experiments have shown that certain painted chambers possess remarkable acoustics. A clap of hands in one spot might reverberate like a drum, while in another it dies instantly, swallowed by porous stone. In fact, many of the most elaborate images, bison, mammoths, horses, are found in the areas of strongest resonance. It seems no coincidence. The artist chose not only surfaces, but spaces, selecting chambers where sound gathered and magnified. When firelight flickered across painted walls and chants rose, the experience must have been overwhelming. The animals did not only move in shadow, they thundered in echoes, their hooves pounding invisibly, their roars rumbling through the stone. The cave became a living stage, a fusion of image and sound, illusion and vibration. We can picture the rituals. A small group gathered, torches dimmed, voices rising in rhythm. Perhaps they struck bones against rock, creating hollow beats. Perhaps they blew through tubes of reed or bone, producing eerie notes that lingered long after breath had stopped. The echoes would have carried these sounds, bending them, multiplying them until it seemed that the cave itself was singing. In that chorus, one could believe in spirits, in ancestors, in gods hidden behind the stone. The cave was not a void, but a throat, and those who entered became part of its voice. Archaeological finds support this vision. In several sites, fragments of flutes carved from bird bones have been unearthed, with carefully drilled holes arranged to create different pitches. When replicas are played, they produce melodies haunting in their simplicity, a music both fragile and enduring. It is astonishing to think that while megafauna roamed the plains, while glaciers pressed across the continent, humans were already making music, coaxing songs from hollow bones. These instruments may well have been played inside caves, where their notes would have seemed supernatural, doubled and redoubled by the echoes. To discover such flutes buried in sediment is to touch the deep roots of our impulse to sing, to create sound, not for survival, but for meaning. But sound in the cave was not always gentle. A sudden shout in a narrow tunnel can be terrifying, the echo crashing back like a roar. Some chambers create standing waves, where a single low hum vibrates the entire body. It is easy to imagine these effects used deliberately to frighten, to awe, to mark the transition from ordinary space to sacred space. For a young initiate brought into such chambers, the first echo of their own voice might have felt like contact with another world. The elders could have used this effect to teach, to instill reverence, to create memories that burned as brightly as firelight. The echoes were tools, not only of curiosity, but of power. Even the animals painted on walls may have been chosen for their sounds as much as their shapes. Bison bellowed in low, resonant tones. Horses whinnied and snorted. Lions roared in thunderous bursts. To sing or chant in their presence was to summon their voices, to make the cave resound with the calls of the creatures themselves. Some researchers propose that the paintings were not simply visual, but part of performances in which the echoes imitated the sounds of the beasts. The cave, then, was not only a gallery, but a simulation, an immersive world where sound and vision combined to conjure the life outside. This blending of senses created experiences far richer than either alone, a kind of primal multimedia that bound the community together in awe. We can also think of sound as memory. When a voice dies away in open air, it is gone forever. But in the cave, it lingers, transformed into echo. It is as if the stone holds onto the sound, repeating it, refusing to let it vanish. Perhaps our ancestors felt that their voices could live on in this way, that speaking or singing in the cave allowed them to leave something behind, however brief. Just as handprints fixed a gesture in pigment, echoes fixed a voice in vibration, if only for moments. Together, they gave the illusion of permanence, of continuity against the erasure of time. The archaeological record occasionally preserves indirect signs of such rituals. In one cave, smears of pigment extend outward from painted walls, as though dancers pressed against them, their bodies swaying in rhythm. In another, clusters of broken stalactites suggest deliberate striking, perhaps to create tones. Forensic analysis of certain fractures reveals impacts consistent with percussion. These are not random damages, but actions with intent. The cave was not only observed, it was played. Its surfaces were instruments, its hollows amplifiers. To walk inside was to step into a world already alive with potential sound, waiting for human hands to unlock it. Even today, when researchers or visitors test the echoes, they often describe a sense of uncanny presence, as though the cave refuses to be silent. A single note from a flute, a hum in the throat, expands into a choir that seems too large for the small number of people present. In that magnification lies the feeling of communion, whether with spirits, ancestors, or simply the vastness of nature itself. The echoes blur the boundary between self and other, between one voice and many. They suggest that the cave belongs not to individuals, but to all who enter, binding them in shared vibration. The shadows of fire and the echoes of sound were twin forces, transforming stone into stage. Fire gave vision, echo gave voice. Together, They created ceremonies that must have felt transcendent, carrying hunters and gatherers into realms beyond hunger and cold. The walls bore their handprints, the ceilings their soot, the floors their footprints, but the air itself bore their voices, fleeting yet powerful. Though the echoes have long since faded, the memory of them lingers in the very placement of paintings, in the clustering of marks where resonance is strongest. These choices remind us that early humans were not only painters, but choreographers of experience, crafting multi-sensory rituals that touched every sense at once. When we step into those spaces now, silence greets us first. But if we are bold enough to clap, to sing, to let our voice wander into the dark, we hear what they must have heard. The cave answering back, stone becoming partner in song. For an instant, the boundary between then and now blurs, and we stand in the same resonance chamber as they did, 40,000 years apart, yet linked by the same simple marvel, the world speaking back. The echoes remind us that humanity has always sought dialogue, not only with one another, but with the larger world. To sing into stone and hear it answer is to know that we are not alone. And that realization, in all its mystery and power, is perhaps why our ancestors chose these chambers to paint, to gather, to remember. They were not seeking silence. They were seeking resonance, and in resonance, they found a glimpse of eternity. A hand is the most ordinary of things. We see it every day, reaching, holding, grasping. Yet when pressed against stone and outlined in pigment, it becomes extraordinary, a bridge across time. The handprints on cave walls are more than decoration. They are signatures, declarations of selfhood in a world where no other record remains. To stand before them is to realize that 40,000 years ago, someone chose to leave behind not an image of an animal, not a scene of survival, but the shape of their own body, their own presence. It is as if they signed the cave, not with letters or names, but with the most intimate symbol they possessed, their hand. Each print is unique. The spread of fingers, the length of the palm, the curve of the thumb, no two are the same. Modern researchers, applying forensic methods used in crime scenes, have analyzed these shapes in astonishing detail. By measuring the ratio of finger lengths, they can estimate the sex of the individual, often discovering that many prints belong to women and adolescents rather than the male hunters once assumed. By comparing sizes, they identify the hands of children, some tiny and fragile, pressed next to larger ones, perhaps a family captured in pigment. In one cave, overlapping prints of different sizes suggest generations layering their presence, a mother's hand beside a child's, an elder's hand above them both. The wall becomes a genealogy, a silent record of kinship preserved in ochre. We can imagine the ritual. A group gathers. Someone grinds the red pigment. Another mixes it with saliva or animal fat to form paste. A hand is placed against the cool rock, and pigment is blown over it through a hollow bone, filling the air with red dust. The hand is removed, leaving a pale void surrounded by color, an absence that is presence. The group murmurs approval, laughter perhaps, or reverence. The child stares at their mark in wonder. The elder nods, remembering the prints of those long gone. Each new hand extends the chain, a continuity across time. These are not random gestures, but deliberate acts of inclusion, ways of saying, I belong to this place, to these people, to this story. The choice of the hand is revealing. Unlike tools, weapons, or ornaments, The hand is universal, shared by all, yet marked by individuality. To press it on the wall is to declare both identity and humanity at once. In a world where death was constant, to leave one's hand was to leave something unperishable, a trace immune to decay. Bones crumble, flesh disappears, voices vanish, but the handprint endures. It is a fossil of intention, a signature carved not in ink, but in dust and breath. And unlike the bones buried in silence, the hand reaches outward, visible to any who come after, an act of communication across millennia. Sometimes the prints are arranged in patterns, rows, or clusters, as though composing a chorus of identities. One wall shows dozens of hands overlapping, a mass of presence that feels almost overwhelming, as though the entire community pressed themselves against the stone. The effect is less about individuals than about collective memory, a shared statement. We are here together. In this way, the prints blur the line between self and group, reminding us that identity was never solitary, but woven into the clan. Each hand is both personal and communal, both I and we. To see them today is to witness not only the individuality of ancient people, but their belonging to one another. The hands also vary in condition. Some are crisp and clear, the pigment well preserved, as though freshly made. Others are faded, edges blurred by time, fragments missing where rock has flaked away. In this layering of clarity and erosion lies another story: the endurance and fragility of memory. Some identities survive untouched, others fade, but together they form a tapestry of presence. Archaeologists sometimes remark on the poignancy of these layers, noting that later prints occasionally cover earlier ones, intentionally or not. Was this a way of renewing memory, of keeping the wall alive by constant addition? Or was it simply the natural consequence of continuity, each generation adding without erasing? In either case, the wall becomes dynamic, a living canvas of identity, always in motion, always accumulating. There is also the mystery of the missing fingers. In some caves, handprints show truncated digits, as though fingers had been deliberately removed or folded under before pigment was applied. Some scholars suggest this represents ritual mutilation, fingers lost to frostbite or war. Others argue it was symbolic, a code of gestures, a language of signs pressed into pigment. Whatever the truth, these altered hands add another layer of meaning. Identity was not only affirmed, but also transformed, marked by suffering, sacrifice, or communication beyond words. The wall becomes not only a record of who they were, but of what they endured, the trials etched into their very bodies. Comparisons to burial sites deepen this sense of signature. In some graves, bones are painted with ochre, the same pigment used for handprints, as though to link the dead with the living marks on walls. A handprint in life, a red dusted bone in death. Both are signatures, both are ways of declaring continuity. The pigment binds them, bridging the gap between presence and absence. Archaeologists often note that ochre is among the most universal of ancient substances, found in graves, on tools, in paintings across continents. Its use with hands emphasizes the desire to leave a recognizable trace, to connect the individual body to the larger memory of the group. The color is not just decoration, but a medium of identity. Even today, when we stand before these ancient signatures, the effect is intimate. Unlike the painted animals, which awe us with their scale and artistry, the hands move us with their simplicity. We can match our own hand to theirs, palm against palm, across 40 millennia, and feel the strange warmth of recognition. The fingers are the same length, the palm the same shape, the gesture unchanged. It is a moment of collapse, where the gulf of time shrinks to nothing, and we find ourselves not only observing the past, but touching it. In that instant, we feel not only curiosity, but kinship. These are not abstractions, not anonymous shadows, but individuals, people who once laughed, wept, dreamed, and pressed their hands to stone as we might press ours to glass. Their signatures are still legible, still speaking, still reminding us that humanity's oldest instinct is to be remembered. The hands on cave walls remind us that identity is not fixed in names or stories alone. It is inscribed in gestures, in the body itself. To sign with the hand was to leave behind the most personal mark possible, one that no other creature could replicate. No mammoth, no lion, no bison could press its paw in such a way. The hand was uniquely human, a symbol of agency and creativity. In choosing to leave their hands, our ancestors declared themselves not only as hunters or survivors, but as beings of meaning, capable of reaching through time. Their signatures endure because they chose the perfect medium, themselves. And so the walls of caves are not just galleries, but archives of identity. Each handprint is a voice without sound, a name without letters, a life without a face. Together, they form the oldest signatures of humanity, still visible, still reaching outward. When we press our hands against the same walls, even without pigment, we add ourselves to that chain, silently affirming that we too belong, that we too wish to be remembered. In that gesture, we echo them, and they echo us across the stone, across the silence, across the unimaginable distance of 40,000 years. The Ice Age world was not humanity's alone. It belonged first to the great beasts that roamed the plains, the predators whose strength and ferocity shaped every decision our ancestors made. To leave the safety of the cave was to step into a theater of danger, where the roles of hunter and hunted could change in a heartbeat. The painted walls remind us of this balance. Horses, bison, and mammoths stride across the rock in vivid motion, but alongside them stalk lions, bears, wolves, and other predators. They are not mere decorations. They are testimonies of fear and awe, of encounters with creatures that could end a human life in seconds. To walk in that world was to live in constant negotiation with forces larger, faster, stronger than oneself. Prey was necessary, but predators defined the rules of survival. Among the most formidable was the cave lion. Larger than any modern lion, with males possibly reaching 400 kilograms, it dominated the grasslands of Europe and Asia. Fossil remains confirm their size, their skulls massive, their teeth capable of crushing bone. To face such an animal was to confront death made flesh, and yet our ancestors did not avoid painting them. In some caves, lions are shown prowling in groups, even mid-hunt, their bodies drawn with sleek lines that capture both grace and menace. They were both threat and symbol, embodying the duality of power. Archaeologists have found lion bones with cut marks, evidence that they were sometimes hunted, perhaps for their skins, perhaps in ritual combat. But just as often, human bones bear punctures spaced like lion fangs, grim proof of nights when the predator prevailed. These interactions, preserved in fossil and pigment, tell of a relationship neither of dominance nor submission, but of mutual recognition, predator facing predator. The cave bear was another force to reckon with. Towering on its hind legs, it must have seemed a walking mountain. Caves themselves were often its winter refuge, and so humans who ventured inside risked stumbling upon a slumbering giant. Excavations have uncovered bear skulls arranged in strange patterns, circles or rows that suggest ritual significance. Were they trophies of conquest or offerings to appease a feared spirit? No one knows for certain. What is clear is that bears haunted the imagination of Ice Age people. Their bones, thick and powerful, sometimes carry cut marks, but often they appear untouched, as though deliberately preserved. Perhaps the bear was not merely food, but a rival, a sacred beast whose presence demanded respect. To paint it on walls was to acknowledge its dominion as much as its danger, and yet it was not only the giants that posed threats. Packs of wolves prowled the periphery of human camps, their eyes glowing in firelight, their howls echoing across the night. Sometimes they followed hunters, waiting for a chance to snatch scraps or drive away the weak. Fossil evidence shows early interactions that blur into domestication. Wolf bones found near human remains, some showing signs of care, of survival after injuries that would have killed them in the wild. From predator to partner, the wolf's path intertwines with humanity's. But in the caves of 40,000 years ago, they were still a danger, still a presence both feared and admired. To imagine the first tentative bond, a pup taken in, raised by firelight, its howl blending with human voice, is to glimpse the earliest threads of partnership woven out of predator and prey. The mammoth, though not a predator, loomed equally large in the imagination. Its tusks curved like moons, its bulk shadowing the plains. Fossil graveyards of mammoths, places where entire herds perished in bogs or floods, reveal the immense scale of these animals. Cut marks on their bones show that humans scavenged and hunted them, though always at great risk. To bring down a mammoth required coordination, courage, and no small measure of luck. And when they succeeded, the reward was enormous. Meat for weeks, hides for shelters, bones for tools. Paintings of mammoths show them both majestic and vulnerable, their outlines thick and deliberate, as if to capture their weight. They were prey, yes, but also teachers of endurance, symbols of abundance and fragility alike. The hyena, often forgotten today, was a constant competitor. Larger than modern hyenas, their packs claimed carcasses as fiercely as any lion. Fossilized dens reveal bones cracked and chewed, the remains of feasts both animal and human. In some caves, hyena bones are found scattered with human remains, suggesting that the line between predator and scavenger was thin. If a hunter fell, the hyenas would not hesitate. To paint such creatures, or to avoid painting them, was to grapple with their role in the ecology of survival. The hunters may have despised them, or perhaps feared them too much to immortalize. Their absence in many paintings is as telling as their presence elsewhere, silence speaking its own kind of truth. What strikes us most is the intimacy of these relationships. These were not distant animals, glimpsed only in passing. They shared the same landscapes, the same water sources, sometimes the same caves. Their bones lie in the same layers of sediment as human bones, their tracks pressed into the same mud. To study these remains is to see how interwoven their lives were with ours. Forensic analysis of bite marks on human bones reveals stories of attack and defense, of desperate struggles where survival balanced on the edge of a fang. Conversely, cut marks on animal bones reveal deliberate, skilled butchery, the carving of flesh from creatures that once inspired terror. predator and prey, hunter and hunted. These roles were fluid, shifting with circumstance. Our ancestors knew that on any given day, they could be either. The paintings capture this ambiguity. A lion crouches, but is it stalking humans or prey? A bison charges, but is it hunted or defending itself? The artists left the stories open, as though to acknowledge that the truth was not one-sided. Life was not a tale of human triumph, but of balance, a precarious coexistence where reverence and fear coexisted. Even the choice of pigments, red for blood, black for shadow, speaks to the drama of this relationship. The animals are not mere subjects. They are protagonists in the same struggle. Their fates intertwined with the humans who painted them. Modern excavations add texture to these visions. In one site, a lion's jaw was found buried beside human tools, as though claimed as a prize or talisman. In another, the skeleton of a young man bore deep gashes consistent with a bear attack, his bones preserved in sediment that hardened into a silent memorial. Elsewhere, entire clusters of horse bones were unearthed, cut clean by sharp flint, suggesting organized hunts where humans dominated the herd. Each find adds another thread, another reminder that survival was written not only in pigment, but in blood, ash, and fossil. To imagine living in that world is to feel both terror and wonder. Every step outside the cave was risk. Every shadow held possibility. A roar could signal death, a herd could signal feast, and in between was the fragile human body, vulnerable yet resilient. And yet from that precarious existence emerged art, memory, reverence. They did not only kill animals, they painted them, honored them, embedded them in myth. Predators and prey alike became part of a symbolic order, a world in which survival was never taken for granted, but always seen as part of something larger. The cave walls testify not to domination, but to respect, a recognition that life was a balance maintained by constant struggle. When we look at those images now, the lions stalking, the mammoths lumbering, the horses leaping, we see not only animals, but reflections of ourselves. The hands pressed among them remind us that humanity was never outside this world, but always inside it, bound by the same laws, subject to the same dangers. Predators and prey shaped us, just as we shaped them, forging a relationship written in pigment, bone, and silence. To acknowledge this is to understand that the art on cave walls is not merely history, but inheritance. The predators and prey of the Ice Age still haunt us, not in body, but in memory. Their power preserved by the humans who once lived, and sometimes died, among them. Not every mark on the cave wall is a hand or an animal. Some are lines, dots, spirals, grids, or shapes that resist easy interpretation. To modern eyes, they seem simple, almost childlike, yet they carry a weight that suggests intention. These abstract signs appear again and again across different caves, scattered among the images of horses, bison, and mammoths. They are the hidden language of the Ice Age, the marks of meaning beyond survival. To look at them is to realize that art was not only about depicting the visible world, but also about mapping the invisible, dreams, spirits, forces that could not be painted as flesh and bone. They are maps of spirits, cartographies of belief traced in pigment and stone. Consider the rows of dots found alongside painted animals. Sometimes they march in neat sequences. Other times, they cluster in chaotic bursts. Archaeologists debate their purpose. Were they counting tools, records of lunar cycles, a primitive calendar tracking migrations and seasons? Or were they signs of ritual, each dot a mark of invocation, a symbolic chant made visible? Some researchers have compared them to tally sticks and notched bones discovered in ancient layers, objects that may have recorded numbers. If so, then the cave walls might have functioned as early ledgers, memories written in dots and lines. But even if practical, their placement near sacred animals suggests a blending of utility and myth, as though to count was not only to measure, but also to honor. A line of dots near a bison is not only an account of time, but a prayer for its return. Then there are the spirals and zigzags, recurring motifs etched and painted deep inside. To us, they may look decorative, but neurologists studying trance states recognize them as patterns the human brain generates when under stress, fatigue, or altered consciousness. Dots, grids, zigzags, these are the first shapes the mind produces when flooded with light or vision. Perhaps the shamans of the Paleolithic world saw them while in ritual trance, induced by drumming, dancing, or deprivation, and then inscribed them on the walls as records of inner journeys. If so, the caves are not only archives of animals and people, but of consciousness itself, diaries of visions scrawled in pigment. To paint a zigzag was to declare, "I have seen beyond the ordinary." Some chambers intensify this possibility. The further one ventures, the thinner the air becomes, the more exhausting the darkness. To reach the deepest walls meant hours of crawling, the smoke of torches filling lungs, the heart hammering from exertion. In such conditions, hallucinations are likely, visions conjured by oxygen deprivation and firelight. The strange symbols painted there may be the literal traces of altered states, not accidents, but purposeful journeys into the edges of perception. The cave, in this sense, was not only a theater, but a temple, its architecture designed to induce transformation. To follow the path inward was to leave the ordinary world behind and to enter a cartography of spirits, traced on walls for those who came after. Excavations reveal further clues. In some caves, small alcoves contain collections of objects, shells carried from distant shores, bones carved with geometric notches, fragments of mineral crystals placed deliberately in cracks. These are not practical stores, but offerings, deposits of meaning left for spirits or ancestors. Forensic analysis of wear on certain bones suggests they were handled often, rubbed smooth by fingers over generations, perhaps as talismans and rituals. When placed beside abstract paintings, these objects reinforce the idea that the caves were sanctuaries of the unseen, maps of belief both painted and material. The dots and lines were not isolated. They were part of a larger practice of symbol and offering, gesture, and memory. The most enigmatic symbols are those that resemble humans, but not quite. Figures with outstretched arms, bodies merging with animals, shapes that are neither entirely human nor beast. These hybrid forms, scattered and rare, hint at shamanic transformation, at the idea that the boundaries between man and animal, body and spirit, could be crossed. A figure with antlers drawn above its head, another with the torso of a man and the face of a bird. Such images are not depictions of daily life, but of visions, encounters with the other world. They suggest that the hunt was not merely a physical pursuit, but a spiritual one, a dialogue with forces embodied by animals. To take a life was to engage with its spirit, to cross thresholds invisible but powerful. The hybrids are the guides of such journeys, painted maps of the liminal state where human and animal blur. The echoes of ritual violence appear here too, Some symbols are scratched violently into the walls, gouged rather than painted, as though the act of incision mattered more than the shape. Others are layered with repeated blows of pigment, over and over, until the rock seems bruised with color. Forensic-style analysis of pigment layers reveals multiple applications over centuries, suggesting that rituals were repeated, symbols refreshed as if to keep them alive. This persistence hints at tradition, at a shared language understood across generations, even when its precise meaning remains hidden to us. To stand before such a mark today is to confront not a picture, but a presence, the residue of acts that once carried sacred weight. The comparison to burial customs is striking. In graves, archaeologists often find objects with no clear practical use: beads, shells, ochre, carved bones. These offerings mirror the abstract symbols of the caves, both serving as tokens in the dialogue with the unseen. Just as a grave, filled with ochre, transforms the dead into something more than flesh, so too does a wall filled with dots and spirals transform the cave into more than stone. Both are acts of inscription into another world, ways of navigating spaces that cannot be mapped by sight alone. They are maps not of geography, but of spirit, not of rivers and mountains, but of dreams and fears. The impact of these symbols on us today is subtle but powerful. Unlike the vivid animals, which impress with artistry, the dots and lines perplex with mystery. They refuse easy interpretation, forcing us to confront the possibility that much of human meaning lies forever beyond translation. And yet, paradoxically, their simplicity connects us. We, too, draw spirals in idle moments, trace lines in the sand, mark tallies on paper. The impulse to symbolize, to abstract, to map the unseen is not confined to the Paleolithic. It is human at its core. These signs remind us that imagination is as old as survival, that the mind has always sought to reach beyond what is immediately visible. In the end, the caves are not just places of art, but places of thought. The animals show us what they hunted. The hands show us who they were. But the abstract marks show us what they imagined, what they believed, what they could not see, yet still felt. They are the earliest maps of spirits, drawn not to guide across land, but to guide across mystery. To follow them is to follow the first cartographers of the unseen, the people who believed that meaning did not stop at the edge of the visible world. Their maps are incomplete, their symbols enigmatic, but they endure. Reminders that even in the cold of the Ice Age, the human spirit was charting new worlds. The Ice Age was not gentle, and the bodies of our ancestors bear witness to its brutality. Beneath the earth, skeletons tell a story written in fractures, scars, and traces of survival. To live then was to endure hardship, to walk daily on the edge of injury and death. Yet alongside the marks of violence are signs of tenderness, bones that show healing, lives extended by care, evidence that the wounded were not abandoned, but carried, fed, and sheltered until they could stand again. The caves preserve not only the art of those who painted, but also the silent testimony of those who suffered and those who healed them. Imagine a hunter facing a charging bison, the spear poised, but the beast moving faster than expected. The impact shatters ribs, knocks the man breathless into the snow. In a world without hospitals, without surgeons, such injuries could easily be fatal. Yet bones tell us that some survived. Archaeologists have uncovered skeletons with healed rib fractures, joints regrown after dislocation, skulls bearing the signs of trauma, but also of recovery. These are not isolated miracles, but patterns repeated across sites, proof that early humans tended to their wounded. Someone must have bound the ribs, fed the injured, kept them warm by the fire until the bones knit back together. Someone must have chosen compassion over abandonment. In that choice lies a deep truth. Survival was never only about strength. It was also about care. The bones of children reveal similar stories. A small skeleton unearthed in France shows a congenital disorder that would have made walking nearly impossible. Yet the bones indicate the child lived for years, far longer than chance would allow without help. This means the community must have carried them, fed them, protected them from predators and cold. In such acts, we glimpse not only survival strategies, but love, the willingness to preserve life, even when it could not contribute to the hunt. The handprints of children on cave walls gain new depth in this light. They are not only marks of belonging, but of resilience, proof that the weak were still cherished, their voices still valued. Compassion, it seems, is as ancient as hunger, but not every story ends in healing. Some skeletons bear sharp cut marks on bones, gashes aligned with where flesh once was. Forensic analysis shows these cuts match butchery patterns used on animals: disarticulation, marrow extraction. The implication is chilling. In times of famine, some groups may have consumed their dead. Others suggest ritual defleshing, a symbolic act rather than cannibalism. The bones themselves cannot reveal intent, only the cold traces of blades. Whatever the truth, they remind us that desperation and belief often walked side by side. To confront death was to make choices we can scarcely imagine, choices written into bone with the precision of stone tools. There are also signs of medical attempts, crude yet remarkable. In one burial, a skull bears a round hole, edges smoothed by regrowth. This is trepanation, the deliberate cutting or scraping away of bone, perhaps to relieve pressure from injury, perhaps to release spirits believed to cause illness. The survival of the individual proves the procedure succeeded, at least long enough for healing to begin. To picture such an operation in the flickering firelight of a cave, with stone tools scraping against bone, is to marvel at both courage and desperation. Pain must have been immense, risk overwhelming, and yet someone attempted it, guided by belief and the will to save a life. In these traces, we glimpse the origins of medicine, the ancient dialogue between wound and healer. Even teeth preserve the record of struggle. Skulls show abscesses, cavities, enamel worn down by grit in food. Some teeth were lost long before death. The bone healed smooth around the gaps. Such individuals would have struggled to eat, yet they lived, meaning others softened food, shared meat, or chewed for them. In every healed injury, every long survival against odds, we see the fingerprints of community. Survival was never solitary. It was bound to the willingness of others to tend, to feed, to shelter. Without compassion, the species would not have endured. Archaeology confirms this in the quiet language of bone. The paintings themselves sometimes reflect these realities. On one cave wall, a figure appears pierced with spears, its body twisted in pain. Scholars debate whether it depicts a shamanic vision, a myth, or an actual memory of injury. Whatever the case, it shows awareness of suffering, the acknowledgement that wounding was part of life. Some handprints are incomplete, missing fingers that may have been lost to frostbite or violence. In pressing those hands to the wall, individuals claimed their scars, turned loss into presence. The cave thus became not only a gallery of beauty, but also a register of endurance, where the wounded left their mark as surely as the whole. The forensic gaze adds more. In some skeletons, healed fractures show misalignment, bones set poorly, but still functional. Others show evidence of arthritis, joints worn by relentless walking, yet the individuals lived into older age. To reach such years in the Ice Age was itself a triumph, made possible only by support. The elders who pressed their hands against the stone were living repositories of memory, their survival a testament to the care of the group. The healer, whether shaman or simply kin, was as vital as the hunter. Without them, the clan would have thinned, its knowledge lost too soon. In this balance of strength and compassion, humanity found its resilience. Sometimes the evidence is heartbreakingly tender. In one grave, the body of a young man with severe spinal deformities was laid with care, surrounded by ochre and tools. His bones reveal he could not have hunted or fought, yet he was honored in death. The community carried him through life, then gave him ritual in death, affirming his place among them. In these gestures, we see that humanity was never defined only by survival of the fittest, but by survival of the connected, the compassionate, the willing. The wounds that healed are as important as the wounds that killed, for together they tell the story of a species learning to bind itself through care. When we reflect on these traces, we realize that the healer's role is as old as the hunter's. Every scar, every regrown bone, every smooth socket where a tooth once was, speaks of hands that tended, voices that comforted, fire shared with the weak. The caves are not silent on this point. They whisper through their bones, reminding us that even in the harshest of worlds, empathy endured. To paint hands on the wall, to sing in echoing chambers, to bury the dead with ochre, these acts all grow from the same root: the refusal to let life pass unnoticed, the insistence that even the wounded matter. The wounded and the healer stand side by side in the record of prehistory. Without wounds, there is no proof of care. Without healers, there is no survival of the wounded. Their bond is etched into the archaeological record, written in fractures and regrowth, pigment and ritual. It is a story as human as art itself, unfolding in every generation. To see it in bone is to recognize ourselves, for we too carry scars. We too depend on others in weakness. We too heal and are healed. The caves remind us that compassion is not modern, not a luxury of abundance, but an instinct as old as fire. It burned quietly then, as it does now, illuminating the darkness with a softer, steadier flame. In the deepest parts of the caves, among the great animals and the stenciled hands, there are marks far smaller, palm prints no wider than a sparrow's wing, fingers short and delicate, scattered among the larger ones like whispers among shouts. These are the hands of children, pressed onto the walls with the same red pigment, their presence fragile yet undeniable. To stand before them is to feel an ache of recognition. We imagine a child, frightened yet curious, led into the darkness by elders, eyes wide at the flicker of firelight, then lifting a hand to the stone as pigment clouded the air. In that moment, the cave held not only hunters and shamans, but also the youngest of the clan, their voices folded into the chorus of memory. Archaeologists have measured these prints with forensic precision, comparing finger lengths and palm spans to modern growth charts. Many belong to children as young as 2 or 3 years old, others to adolescence, just entering maturity. The presence of such tiny hands complicates older images of cave art as the work of isolated male hunters. It reveals instead a community practice where even the youngest were brought into the sacred darkness, invited to leave their mark. Perhaps it was ritual initiation, a way of binding them to the group. Perhaps it was play, the simple delight of seeing one's hand appear on stone. Or perhaps, as with all rituals, it was both at once, sacred and playful, serious and joyful, memory and moment entwined. The caves also hold the footprints of children, preserved by chance in soft clay that hardened over millennia. In one site, a trail of small prints winds deep into the darkness, accompanied by larger adult prints. The child walked, stumbled, then ran, the toes digging deeper into the earth. In another cave, the footprints of children appear alongside torch soot, as though they carried light themselves, venturing forward with boldness. These traces are among the most moving discoveries of archaeology. Not symbols, not art, but the direct impressions of living bodies in motion. To see them is to see not myth, but reality. A child's step frozen in stone for 40,000 years, a fleeting moment turned eternal. In some places, children's traces hint at play. Finger marks drawn in soft clay, lines traced as though doodles. A smudge of pigment in a place too low for adults, as if a child reached up, impatient to join the artists. Archaeologists sometimes describe these as scribbles. But perhaps they are more than that. Perhaps they are the first experiments of young hands learning the language of art, the tentative gestures that would one day become horses and bison. To imagine a child practicing, guided by an elder's hand, is to realize that the caves were also classrooms, spaces where art and identity were taught across generations. The walls are not only galleries, but chalkboards, bearing the faint lessons of a long-vanished school. Death, too, carried children into the caves. Burials of infants and juveniles have been uncovered in recesses where adults also rest, sometimes sprinkled with red ochre, sometimes accompanied by beads or small tools. The tenderness of these burials is striking. In one case, a baby's body was laid with a necklace of tiny shells, each carefully pierced and threaded. The shells had been carried from a distant shore, proof that the family went to great lengths to honor their loss. In another, ochre was dusted thickly over the child's bones, as though to paint them into memory, to give them color against the gray of death. These burials, though rare, remind us that the cave was not only a place of art, but also of mourning, where even the briefest lives were folded into the sacred fabric of the community. The small handprints gain new poignancy when considered alongside these burials. The same pigment that traced a child's hand in life could be used to cover their bones in death. The hand on the wall and the ochre in the grave are two sides of the same gesture. The affirmation that children belonged, that their presence mattered, even if life proved short. In this way, the caves held not only the laughter of children, but also their silence, their absence marked with ritual, as surely as their presence. Forensic analysis adds further detail. Tiny teeth, worn unevenly, reveal diets full of grit, the result of food ground between stone tools. Growth patterns etched into bones show episodes of malnutrition, illnesses that stunted development. Yet many survived these hardships, carried through by the care of the group. The handprints of small children remind us that in a world of constant hunger, communities still found space for play, initiation, and ritual. Even at the edge of survival, they did not withhold meaning from the youngest. On the contrary, they drew them into the circle, pressed pigment onto their hands, and let them leave their mark on eternity. One can imagine the atmosphere when a child's hand was first stenciled on stone. The adults gather, grinding ochre, preparing the hollow bone. The child, uncertain, is urged forward, hand pressed flat against cold rock. A sibling or parent leans close, blowing pigment over the skin, filling the air with red dust. The child coughs, laughs, or cries, then pulls away to see their own hand glowing on the wall. There it is, proof that they too exist in the sacred space, that their small life is part of the great story. Perhaps applause follows, or a solemn silence. Perhaps the child is lifted up, embraced, or simply allowed to stare in wonder. In that moment, identity is forged not in words, but in gesture, not in names, but in the outline of a hand. Modern visitors often respond most strongly to these small prints. The animals impress, the adult hands inspire, but the child's hand moves us in ways more intimate. We see our own children in them, or remember ourselves. The distance of millennia collapses into the simple fact of growth, the knowledge that children then were as curious, playful, and vulnerable as children now. Their presence in the caves is proof that these spaces were not only sanctuaries for ritual specialists, but homes for entire communities. Everyone entered: hunters, healers, elders, and children. The marks are a record of inclusion, the insistence that no one was too small to belong. In this, we find perhaps the deepest meaning of the children's hands. They remind us that humanity has always looked forward, not only backward. The hand of a child on the wall is a gesture toward the future, a promise that the community story will continue. Even in the harshest of environments, where life could be extinguished in a moment, people invested in continuity, in the survival not just of bodies, but of memory and meaning. The child's hand is a seed planted in stone, a fragile symbol of hope pressed into permanence. When we press our own hand against the same rock today, we feel not only the echo of ancient adults, but the smaller echo of their children. It is as if we are holding hands across time, not only with the strong, but with the young, the uncertain, the fragile. And in that gesture, we recognize the continuity of humanity itself, the truth that our story has always included the laughter, tears, and tiny hands of children. The caves, in preserving their presence, preserve also the tenderness of a species that even in darkness and hunger found space for play, for initiation, for belonging. The children of the cave are not forgotten. They still reach outward, reminding us that every hand, no matter how small, leaves a mark. The Ice Age was a world of extremes, a rhythm not of abundance, but of scarcity. Seasons of hunger defined the lives of our ancestors. Long stretches when snow buried the plains, when herds migrated far beyond reach, when the stores of dried meat dwindled to nothing. In such times, survival became a slow contest with cold and emptiness. The caves preserve these struggles in fragments, bones stripped to the marrow, skeletons marked by signs of malnutrition, hearths where the last embers died. To imagine their lives in winter is to feel the weight of hunger pressing into every choice, every gesture, every breath. Hunger left marks on the body as surely as pigment left marks on stone. Isotopic studies of ancient bones reveal fluctuations in diet, showing periods when protein was scarce, when plants and meager roots formed the bulk of meals. Children's skeletons often carry lines of stress in their teeth. Faint bands formed during times of malnutrition. These enamel hypoplasias are frozen calendars of hunger, recording seasons when growth was stunted, when the body faltered under lack of nourishment. To read them is to hear the whispers of famine, etched not in memory, but in the enamel of every smile. Archaeologists call them markers. We call them echoes of suffering. The bones of animals tell the same story. In kill sites, archaeologists find bones smashed into fragments, marrow painstakingly extracted. The marks of stone tools show not waste, but desperation. Every drop of fat, every sliver of protein scavenged. Even the skulls of small animals were cracked open to scoop the brain, a food rich in calories. Nothing was discarded, nothing ignored. Sometimes, human bones show similar treatment, cut marks aligned with butchery techniques. Whether this was cannibalism born of hunger or ritual dismemberment is debated. But in the depths of scarcity, the line between survival and taboo blurs. The bones speak of choices made when the cold pressed hardest, when hunger roared louder than memory or morality. The caves themselves were refuges during these times. Firelight flickered in the dark while storms raged outside, families huddling together with little to eat. Stories must have filled the silence, myths of return, of spring, of herds coming back across the plains. Perhaps they painted then too, hands pressing against stone in defiance of emptiness, images of animals conjured on walls to ensure their return. The act of painting a bison in winter might not only be art, but invocation, a spell cast against hunger, a hope that by shaping its image they could summon its flesh. Archaeologists sometimes note that certain animals appear more often in paintings than in bone remains, as if their presence was more symbolic than nutritional. Perhaps they were the animals most longed for in times of want, their painted forms a substitute for absent meat. One haunting discovery in Spain revealed footprints of children deep in a cave, their paths winding through soot and ash. The footprints overlap with torch smears and traces of pigment, suggesting they wandered during a ritual, perhaps during a season of hunger, when every gesture became laden with meaning. To imagine children walking barefoot in the cold earth, carrying torches while the clan painted animals on the walls, is to sense both desperation and hope. Hunger may have driven them inward, into ritual, into art, into the conviction that survival required not only flesh, but meaning. In such times, the community gathered not only to eat, but to believe, to strengthen the bonds that hunger threatened to unravel. Skeletal remains add another layer to this story. Some bones show stunted growth, others lesions caused by vitamin deficiencies. In one case, an adolescent skeleton revealed multiple signs of chronic starvation. Bones thin, teeth worn with stress, growth halted years before maturity. Yet this individual lived long enough to leave those records, meaning the group sustained them despite the strain. Hunger pressed them, but they did not abandon their weakest. This is as telling as the paintings. The fact that even when survival was threatened, compassion endured. Hunger narrowed choices, but it did not erase humanity. Seasonal rhythms dictated everything. In summer and autumn, when herds were fat and plants abundant, they hunted and gathered relentlessly, storing what they could. Meat was dried, fat preserved, hides cured, marrow bones kept whole for later cracking. Yet when winter deepened, supplies dwindled. Snow covered the ground, rivers froze, and animals moved south. For weeks or months, they lived on scraps, gnawing old bones, boiling hides into thin broths. Archaeological residues of cracked bones boiled repeatedly for soup confirm this grim reality. The fire hissed with hunger as much as with heat, a cauldron of survival bubbling in the dark. There is evidence, too, of ritual responses to famine. Certain caves hold paintings of abstract symbols alongside animals, shapes that may represent counting or cycles. Some scholars believe these were records of seasons, attempts to track migrations, to anticipate the return of food. Others suggest they were prayers, marks etched in pigment to ask unseen forces for relief. In this way, hunger became not only a physical ordeal, but a spiritual crisis, a force that drove humans to invent, to imagine, to seek meaning in the face of emptiness. The paintings, then, may be as much about hunger as about hunting, not celebrations of abundance, but pleas in times of lack. The firelight must have been heavy with silence in these seasons. Families gathered around meager flames, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The smell of smoke mixed with the faint tang of boiling bone. Children cried from hunger. Elders murmured comfort. Stories filled the gaps that food could not. Perhaps they told of times when animals returned, when spring broke the ice, when the world renewed itself. These stories were not luxuries, but necessities, as essential to endurance as marrow or fire. Without hope, hunger devours not only the body, but the spirit. The caves, filled with paintings, echoes, and handprints, were places where hope was painted into stone, a counterweight to the seasons of hunger. Modern science uncovers the scale of these struggles in chilling detail. Isotopic signatures in collagen reveal shifts in diet, pointing to starvation winters. Piles of broken bones with repetitive fracture marks show desperate attempts to extract every last calorie. In some layers, the absence of large animal bones suggests herds vanished for years, replaced by small game and roots. Each find is a reminder that survival was never guaranteed, that every generation faced the possibility of collapse. And yet they endured, not only with bodies, but with art, ritual, and compassion. Their resilience was not only physical, but cultural, a strength of spirit as much as flesh. To stand in a cave today and feel the cold air is to imagine those winters. You sense the hunger pressing against the walls, the silence of waiting for herds to return, and yet you also see the paintings, the handprints, the symbols. They did not let hunger silence them. They pressed their hands in pigment. They painted animals. They sang into the echoes. They turned scarcity into ritual, emptiness into meaning. In this, they remind us that hunger was not only endured, but transcended, that humanity has always fought not only for food, but for memory, for belonging, for hope. The seasons of hunger left scars in bone and silence in caves, but they also left art, tenderness, and resilience. Every cracked bone, every faded handprint, every dot of pigment is a record of survival against the cold, of meaning created against emptiness. The story of hunger is not only one of deprivation, but of defiance, of a species that chose again and again to endure, to believe, to reach forward into the next season. And in those choices, carved into the archaeology of ash and bone, we see the origins of our own persistence, the ancient rhythm of humanity refusing to yield to silence. The Ice Age world was carved by rivers of ice, colossal glaciers pressing down across continents, reshaping valleys, redirecting streams, gouging the earth into new forms. To live, then, was to live in a landscape that was always shifting, always immense. Across this world, human groups moved like shadows, carrying fire, memory, and hope into new territories. Migration was not a choice, but a necessity, dictated by the herds they followed, the seasons they endured, the land that rose and broke beneath them. To cross those rivers of ice was to gamble with death, but to remain behind was to starve. The story of our ancestors is the story of movement. Footsteps pressed into snow that vanished with a thaw, journeys traced only in bones, tools, and the faint echo of art left behind. Imagine a small band at the edge of a glacier, the air bitter, the sky a white sheet stretched to the horizon. Before them, a river rushes, swollen with meltwater, slabs of ice breaking free with a crack like thunder. To cross is perilous. The current seizes anything that enters, dragging bodies under, smashing them against frozen boulders. Yet on the far side lies pasture, shelter, the trails of migrating animals. They lash together rafts of logs, or wade hand in hand, carrying children above their heads. Some are lost, swept away, their screams swallowed by water. Others reach the far bank, collapsing with exhaustion, clutching fire that must not die. Every crossing is a wound, every survival a triumph. And still they move forward, for motion is the only law in a world ruled by ice. Archaeology offers glimpses of these journeys. Stone tools made of flint from distant quarries appear hundreds of miles from their source, proof that groups carried not only themselves, but the materials of survival across vast distances. Isotopic analysis of ancient teeth reveals diets that shifted across childhood, signatures of water and plants from multiple regions. These are the fingerprints of migration, encoded in enamel, maps written in bone. Fossilized footprints found on riverbanks and dried lake beds tell similar stories. Tracks of families moving together, children alongside adults, sometimes even animals pacing beside them. To follow these trails is to feel the rhythm of migration, the slow heartbeat of humanity's expansion across the world. The rivers of ice were not only obstacles, but also pathways. Glaciers carved open valleys, flattening landscapes into corridors of travel. Frozen rivers served as highways, allowing hunters to move swiftly across ground that in warmer times would have been marsh or forest. Yet each advantage carried danger. A sudden thaw could break the ice, plunging travelers into freezing water. Avalanches thundered from ridges, bearing paths under tons of snow. The landscape was not stable, but alive, groaning, cracking, shifting. To cross it was to listen constantly for sound, to read the land as one reads the face of an animal, alert for signs of threat or passage. In such journeys, survival depended on memory, on the ability to recall which valley flooded in spring, which ridge was safe to climb, which river froze thick enough to bear weight. Knowledge was life, passed in whispers from elder to child, from survivor to novice. Contact between groups often happened in these borderlands, where rivers of ice forced paths to converge. Archaeologists find traces of cultures blending, tools of different styles mingled together, pigments carried from faraway quarries, ornaments fashioned from shells traded across hundreds of miles. Such exchanges speak of meetings not only of conflict, but of kinship, of stories shared around firelight by strangers who spoke in gestures and looks rather than words. Not every encounter was peaceful. Some skeletons bear wounds inflicted by human weapons, arrowheads lodged in bone, skulls fractured by blows. Competition for territory, for food, for safe passage across ice must have led to bloodshed. Yet even amidst rivalry, There was also sharing, the circulation of materials and ideas that tied distant clans into a fragile web of connection. In some places, caves themselves became markers of migration. Paintings echo one another across vast distances, motifs repeated as though carried by memory from one valley to the next. A herd of horses drawn in France recalls the outlines painted thousands of miles away, as if the image itself traveled, passed like a song from group to group. This continuity suggests more than coincidence. It suggests a shared language of symbol, a network of meaning spanning continents. The rivers of ice divided, but the act of painting united, weaving humanity together across distance and danger. The caves are thus not only local sanctuaries, but nodes in a greater map, the first constellations of a world being slowly charted by human hands. The perils of migration are etched in the bones of those who did not survive. In one glacial valley, a cluster of skeletons lies tangled, their bones fractured by rockfalls. Their lives ended in an avalanche. In another, a young woman's remains rest beside the skeleton of a newborn, both buried hurriedly in shallow earth, perhaps victims of drowning or exposure during a crossing. Such finds are rare but poignant, reminders that each movement carried risk, that behind every successful journey lay the silence of those who fell. The rivers of ice were indifferent, claiming lives without notice, yet those who survived carried the memory, pressing it into stories, perhaps even into pigment on walls. A painting of flowing lines, a swirl of dots, may in truth be a memory of rivers, of paths followed, of dangers endured, and yet, for all the hardship, these crossings defined humanity. To move was to adapt, to expand, to encounter new lands and new possibilities. Without them, the painted caves would not exist, for people would have remained clustered in narrow valleys, never reaching the chambers where art bloomed. Migration was not only survival, but creativity, carrying ideas as well as bodies, spreading not only bloodlines, but visions. Each crossing of ice was an act of imagination, a refusal to remain fixed, a belief that on the far side there was something worth enduring the river's wrath. This faith in motion is what carried humanity eventually across continents, across oceans, across the world. To stand today on a glacial riverbank, wind tearing across ice, is to feel the echo of those crossings. You see the slabs drift, hear the crash of water against stone, and you imagine the figures bent against the cold, children clinging to parents, hunters scanning the horizon, fire smoldering in skins tied to their backs. They did not know what lay ahead, but they stepped forward nonetheless, pressing their footprints into snow that melted, into clay that hardened, into memory that endures. The rivers of ice divided and connected, threatened and offered, killed and sustained. To cross them was to become human, to define survival not as staying in place, but as reaching forward. And in every handprint, in every painting carried from one cave to another, we see the trace of those journeys, the unbroken line of motion that led from the first crossings of ice to the world we inhabit today. The caves do not only hold art and echoes of life, they also hold the hush of death. In the stillness of their chambers, where footsteps fade and firelight falters, people once laid their dead to rest. Burials in silence are among the most poignant traces of our ancestors, for they remind us that even in a world ruled by hunger and danger, death was not met with indifference. It was marked, tended, transformed into memory. The bones found in caves, dusted with pigment, arranged with care, tell us that death was not simply an ending, but an occasion for ritual, a moment when the living sought to shape loss into meaning. Archaeologists have uncovered graves where skeletons lie curled in fetal position, as though returning to the posture of the womb. Ochre, the same red pigment used to paint animals and hands on walls, often covers the bones in a thin dust, turning pale remains into glowing reminders of blood and life. To sprinkle ochre over the dead was to paint them into memory, to give color to their silence, perhaps to symbolize rebirth. Some burials include objects: blades carefully chipped from flint, beads made from pierced shells, even fragments of antlers or animal bones. These offerings, unnecessary for decay, tell us the dead were imagined to need or deserve gifts, that death was not absence, but a journey requiring provision. One of the most haunting burials was that of a child discovered with a necklace of seashells. The shells came from a distant coast, carried hundreds of miles from their origin. That such a treasure was placed on a body that would never grow into adulthood speaks of profound tenderness. The shells were not food, not tools, not practical in any way. They were symbols of love, of loss, of beauty preserved against silence. To think of parents kneeling in the firelight, arranging those shells around their child's neck, is to feel the depth of grief and the determination to honor a life too short. The child's bones crumble, but the shells endure, fragile relics of devotion sealed in stone. Some skeletons show signs of fossilization, preserved by the minerals of the cave. Teeth gleam with calcite, skulls glisten with crystalline crusts. These natural processes transform the dead into part of the cave itself, fusing human remains with stone. To find such fossils is to realize that caves did not simply contain burials. They absorbed them, enfolded them, made them permanent. The dead became part of the geology, their silence deepening into eternity. Archaeologists who stumble upon such finds often describe the uncanny sensation of seeing the boundary between human and earth dissolve, of realizing that time has sculpted the dead as surely as the living once sculpted art. Burials also reveal traces of suffering. Some skeletons show healed injuries, others fatal wounds. A skull with a blow to the temple, bones with embedded arrowheads, ribs pierced by sharp flints. These are stories of violence and conflict. Yet even such bodies were buried with care, their wounds not erased, but incorporated into ritual. To bury the slain was to acknowledge their humanity, even if their end came through blood. Forensic analysis sometimes reveals whether they were struck from behind, whether the wounds were defensive, whether they suffered long before death. These readings are clinical, yet they carry weight. They remind us that behind each bone was a story of struggle, of decisions made in the heat of survival. Burials transform those struggles into silence, but the silence is eloquent. Not all burials are solitary. Some caves hold clusters of bodies, arranged side by side. Were these families? Victims of catastrophe? Sacrifices? In one site, 3 individuals lie together, their skulls aligned, ochre sprinkled across all. Perhaps they died together. Perhaps they were placed together to bind them in eternity. In another, bodies were revisited, bones rearranged, skulls removed, perhaps as part of later rituals. The cave became not only a resting place, but a space of ongoing dialogue, where the living returned to tend the dead, to renew memory, to reaffirm bonds. These acts suggest that caves were not abandoned after burial, but remained sacred landscapes woven into the cycles of life and death. The connection between painting and burial is profound. Both used ochre. Both transformed the ordinary into the symbolic. Both sought permanence against decay. A hand pressed onto a wall and a body sprinkled with pigment are two gestures of the same impulse, to declare that life matters, that presence endures. The walls of art and the floors of burials form twin testimonies, one for the living, one for the dead. To walk through a cave that contains both is to sense the unity of expression, the refusal to let silence erase meaning. The same pigment that made a horse gallop across stone was used to paint the bones of those who once hunted it. Art and burial were never separate, but parts of a continuum, a shared human desire to outlast oblivion. The silence of burials lingers even now. Excavators describe the heavy stillness of uncovering bones long hidden, the sense of trespass in peeling back layers of earth. Tools click softly against sediment, brushes sweep gently, and then the form of a skull appears, staring upward after millennia. In that moment, silence presses into the chamber, as though the cave itself holds its breath. These are not simply remains, but presences, lives that once laughed, wept, and breathed the same air. To disturb them is to disturb memory itself. The archaeologist records measurements and photographs, but behind the science lies reverence, an acknowledgement that these burials were acts of love, not simply data points. Sometimes the dead themselves tell stories through their arrangement. A skeleton curled around another, perhaps mother and child, buried together. A hand extended across a gap, bones frozen in gesture. These positions speak of bonds that outlasted breath, of connections honored in burial. Even when the community had little to give, they gave time, care, pigment, and memory. In that, they transformed the silence of death into a different kind of silence, not emptiness, but presence, a stillness that lingers. The caves hold this silence still, heavy and profound, echoing not with voices, but with the weight of remembrance. To consider these burials is to confront both distance and closeness. They are remote, their meanings uncertain, their rituals opaque, yet they are intimate, their tenderness unmistakable, their grief familiar. We bury our dead still. We place tokens. We color absence with symbols. The continuity is staggering. Across 40,000 years, we and they are joined by the same gestures, the same refusal to let death be mere vanishing. The caves teach us that humanity was human long before cities, before writing, before history. They remind us that silence can be eloquent, that memory can be painted in pigment and in dust alike. The burials in silence anchor the story of cave life. They show that the caves were not only refuges or theaters, but sanctuaries, spaces where life and death intertwined. To paint was to affirm life. To bury was to honor its end. The two acts are inseparable, bound by ochre, by ritual, by memory. And as we look upon those bones today, as we see them fused with stone, we hear their silence still, not empty, but filled with meaning, with the persistence of humanity against time. They lie in the caves as they did then, untouched by millennia, still speaking without words, still present in their silence. For too long, the story of the caves was told as though it belonged only to hunters, men chasing mammoths, men painting beasts, men leaving their mark in darkness. But the walls themselves whisper otherwise. Many of the handprints that bloom across the stone do not match the proportions of adult males. Careful forensic analysis, measuring the ratios of finger lengths, reveals that a great number belong to women, and some to adolescents. The makers of the art, were not only the hunters who brought down aurochs and bison, but the mothers, the daughters, the sisters who pressed their hands into pigment and shaped meaning from stone. The cave was not only a theater of hunting, but a house of memory, and women's presence is etched as deeply as any spear mark in bone. It is easy to imagine their role. While men tracked herds across dangerous plains, women gathered plants, tended fires, cared for children, and prepared skins and food. But to reduce them only to this is to miss the breadth of their contribution. Their hands on the walls tell us they were creators of art, keepers of ritual, transmitters of knowledge. The smallest prints may belong to children guided by women, initiated into the rhythms of community by maternal hands. The neat clusters of dots, the repeated abstract signs, may have been painted by those who measured time not in kills, but in cycles, menstrual, seasonal, generational. To mark the cave was to mark continuity, and women were at the center of that continuity. Burials speak this truth in silence. Skeletons of women have been found adorned with beads, wrapped in ochre, sometimes accompanied by tools. One grave revealed the body of a young woman, laid to rest, with hundreds of pierced shells, each bead a testament to hours of labor, patience, and artistry. Another contained a woman with grinding stones, symbols of her role in sustaining the community through food. These burials were not careless disposals. They were honors, acknowledgments that women were as central to the fabric of life and meaning as men. Their work, whether visible in art or invisible in labor, was recognized, memorialized, and carried into ritual. The figurines carved from ivory and stone add another layer. The so-called Venus figurines, with their exaggerated hips, breasts, and bellies, are scattered across Ice Age Europe. Some scholars see them as fertility charms, others as self-portraits of women looking down at their own bodies. Whatever their precise meaning, they reveal an obsession with the female form as source of life, continuity, and survival. To hold such a figurine is to feel the weight of reverence, the acknowledgement that women carried the future within them, that the cycle of life itself depended on their bodies. These figurines, carved with patience and care, are as much sacred art as the painted walls, embodying not only survival, but meaning. And yet the role of women extended beyond the womb. To care for children in a world of predators and hunger required skill and ingenuity. To weave fibers, to tan hides, to shape bone tools. These tasks demanded knowledge as deep as hunting strategies. The patterns of wear on tools suggest that women's hands shaped many of them, their labor embedded in every scrape of hide, every pierced bead. The rhythms of daily survival, less dramatic than the hunt, were nonetheless essential. Without the constant making and tending, the hunters could not have endured. The children could not have grown. The fires could not have burned. To call them makers is not metaphor, but truth. The caves themselves reflect this making. Some of the most intimate images, the handprints, the small clusters of signs, bear the touch of women's hands. It is possible to imagine them leading the rituals, guiding children to press their palms, blowing pigment over the skin, singing as echoes answered. The cave, then, was not only a male space of hunting magic, but a shared sanctuary, a place where women shaped memory as surely as men. The distinction between roles blurs when we look at the evidence closely. Survival required all, and meaning was made by all. The walls do not lie. Women were present, and they left themselves behind. There is tenderness in imagining mothers leading children into the depths, a torch flickering, a hand pressed against stone, a voice soothing in the darkness. The child, afraid of shadows, clings to the mother, who steadies them, then shows them how to leave a mark. In that act, identity is passed on, belonging is forged, and continuity is ensured. The mark is not only the child's, but the mother's as well, a trace of both presence and teaching. The walls become not only art, but lineage, the record of lives woven together in pigment and breath. Even violence and survival reveal their presence. Skeletons of women show healed injuries, signs of the same struggles faced by men. Some carry spear wounds, others fractures from falls or blows. They too risked and endured, and when they died, they were buried with care, their bones stained with ochre, their absence marked with offerings. These burials confirm that the community valued them not only as bearers of children, but as participants in the full drama of life. They hunted small game, gathered plants, crafted tools, painted walls, buried the dead. Their presence was everywhere, even if later stories chose to forget. Modern eyes often search for heroes in the past, but the caves remind us that survival was collective, that heroism was not only in the hunt, but in the hearth, not only in the kill, but in the care. Women's roles as makers, of tools, of art, of ritual, of life itself, are inscribed in ochre, in beads, in bones. To ignore them is to ignore half the story, half the hands pressed against the stone. Their signatures remain, clear and undeniable, reminding us that humanity has always been a weaving of voices, not a single thread, but a tapestry. And so, when we gaze upon the walls today, we must imagine not only the hunters returning with bloodied spears, but also the women grinding pigment, guiding children, shaping beads, pressing their hands into the same rock. We must imagine them singing into the echoes, carrying torches, burying their dead with tenderness. They were mothers, yes, but also artists, makers, keepers of meaning. Their presence is not absence, but permanence, pressed into stone, woven into ritual, enduring in silence. The caves are their story too, their theater, their archive. To honor them is to honor the fullness of humanity, the truth that the making of meaning has always been shared. The red hands and painted beasts of Europe are not alone. Far from the Pyrenees and Dordogne, far from the limestone caves of France and Spain, the same visions appear. Across continents, in distant valleys, on cliffs where the wind still sighs, the flood of red spreads. Australia, Indonesia, Africa, the Americas, all hold marks left by human hands, often in the same color, often in the same form. To see this is to realize that cave art is not a local curiosity, but a global tide, a red flood sweeping through human history. Wherever people went, they carried ochre, they carried pigment, they carried the urge to inscribe meaning into stone. It is as though humanity itself was compelled to press its presence into the earth, to declare in one shared language, "We are here." Archaeology uncovers this story in fragments. In Sulawesi, Indonesia, a hand stencil, nearly 40,000 years old, blooms on a cave wall, its pigment identical in hue to those in Europe. In Australia, vast galleries of ochre paintings stretch across cliffs, hands and figures layered upon one another through millennia. In southern Africa, rock shelters hold depictions of antelope and human figures, etched and painted in red, the same color that covers burials in Europe. The materials differ slightly. Minerals available, binders chosen. But the impulse is the same. Red ochre, the dust of earth transformed into symbol, appears everywhere humanity traveled. It is the thread that ties us together across oceans and time, the river of pigment that refuses to fade. The spread of ochre use is among the earliest and most universal markers of symbolic behavior. Archaeologists have found ochre not only in art, but in burials, in grindstones used to produce powder, in residues on tools thousands of miles apart. In Blombos Cave, South Africa, engraved pieces of ochre bear cross-hatched designs over 70,000 years old, long before the paintings of Europe. These engravings, abstract and deliberate, suggest that symbolic thought was not a sudden invention in one place, but a current that flowed outward, carried by migrating groups as they spread across the world. The Red Flood began early, and it never stopped. The reasons for this universality are debated. Was ochre chosen for its practicality as an insect repellent, a sunscreen, and antiseptic for wounds? Or was it chosen for its symbolism, its resemblance to blood, its brightness against stone? The truth is likely both. Practical uses would have made ochre familiar, but its visual and emotional power would have transformed it into something sacred. To dust the dead in red, to press red hands on walls, to mark tools with red scratches. These acts fused utility with meaning. The pigment was not just mineral, but metaphor, carried across landscapes because it was indispensable in both life and spirit. In this way, the flood of red was not only geographic, but symbolic, a tide of meaning flowing through human thought. Contact between regions is difficult to prove, yet the echoes are undeniable. The same motifs, hands, dots, spirals, animals, appear in places separated by thousands of miles and tens of millennia. Some see this as independent invention, the natural result of minds shaped alike by similar needs and perceptions. Others wonder if stories and rituals traveled farther than we think, carried in fragments by migrating groups who met, traded, and parted. Whatever the path, the result is clear. Humanity shared a grammar of art long before it shared cities or writing. The Red Flood united us before we even knew we were one species across the globe. The archaeological record reveals not only art, but the movement of pigment itself. In some caves, ochre was carried from sources dozens of miles away, chosen for its particular shade or texture. Traces of exotic ochre, chemically distinct from local deposits, testify to journeys made to obtain it or to exchanges between groups. In this way, the Red Flood was not accidental, but deliberate. People valued pigment enough to carry it across rivers of ice, across deserts, across mountain passes, to grind it, to mix it with saliva or fat, to blow it across a hand, or brush it onto stone was an act prepared long before the cave was reached. The flood was carried in pouches, in mines, in rituals, spreading as surely as footsteps. Fossils and bones found alongside these pigments reinforce the story. A burial in Russia reveals a man covered entirely in ochre, his grave goods painted the same shade. In Africa, beads coated with red pigment lie beside skeletons, tiny ornaments made luminous in the soil. In Australia, red handprints adorn cliffs where burials also took place, binding life and death in the same color. These discoveries confirm that the Red Flood was not only art, but cosmology, a system of meaning that linked the body, the earth, and the spirit in one. To paint was to connect. To bury was to affirm. To mark with ochre was to declare participation in a wider universe of meaning. The persistence of the flood is astonishing. Unlike organic dyes, ochre does not fade easily. Its iron oxide clings to stone for tens of thousands of years, its brightness resisting the erosion of time. This endurance may have been part of its power. People saw that it outlasted fire and flesh, that it clung when all else vanished. To mark in red was to reach beyond mortality, to press a sign into the future. When modern archaeologists brush away sediment and see that glow of color return, they are witnessing the same quality that our ancestors must have recognized: the refusal of red to die. It is as close to permanence as pigment can be, and so it became humanity's universal ink. When we trace this flood across continents, we see more than pigment. We see connection. Groups separated by oceans still shared the instinct to mark their presence, to transform stone with color, to bind the living and the dead through ritual. The caves of France and Spain are famous, but they are only part of a much larger chorus. The cliffs of Sulawesi, the rock shelters of Australia, the sands of Africa all sing the same song in red. To call it coincidence is to underestimate the unity of human imagination. To call it diffusion is to ignore the depth of independent thought. Perhaps it is both at once, a convergence of minds drawn to the same color, the same gesture, the same need to be remembered. Standing before a handprint in Indonesia and another in France, separated by half the planet, one feels the immensity of this flood. Different people, different times, different landscapes, but the same hand pressed against stone, the same red cloud blown through hollow bone. The gesture is identical, the meaning unspoken but shared. Across 40 millennia, across continents, humanity was already one in this: the desire to leave a mark, to say we are here. The red flood was not only pigment, but presence. The first global language, carried not in words, but in color. The caves are silent now, but their voices have not vanished. They echo in the traditions of peoples who still paint, carve, and sing the land into meaning. To look at the animals and symbols of 40,000 years ago is to feel the presence of a language that has never entirely disappeared, a voice that still murmurs in the rituals of indigenous communities across the world. The walls are not relics of a vanished past, but part of a living continuum. Voices of stone that have been speaking all along. When archaeologists first entered the great painted caves, many dismissed the images as primitive doodles, meaningless scratches of a simple people. But others began to notice parallels with the art of Aboriginal Australians, sand peoples of southern Africa, Native Americans, and Arctic shamans. These groups, living in ways more closely tied to the land, revealed a vocabulary of art and ritual that illuminated the caves. Spirals, dots, handprints, animals drawn with reverence, all appeared not only in Paleolithic chambers, but in modern traditions. The similarities are not accidents. They emerge from a shared human relationship to land, to spirit, to the mysteries of survival. In the deserts of Australia, rock shelters blaze with ochre figures of kangaroos, emus, and ancestral beings. The pigments are the same as those pressed onto cave walls in Europe: red ochre ground from the earth, mixed with fat, painted in layers. The meaning, too, resonates. Animals are not only food, but ancestors, beings of power whose images sustain life. When Aboriginal elders describe painting as a way of keeping the dreaming alive, we hear echoes of Ice Age ritual. To paint was never only to decorate. It was to speak with stone, to renew the bond between people, land, and spirit. In southern Africa, the sands still paint eland and other animals on rock walls, figures often surrounded by dots and lines. These are not literal depictions, but visions. born of trance, of shamans crossing between worlds. When anthropologists recorded sand shamans describing the moment of transformation, when the body shakes and the spirit becomes animal, they found images that mirrored the hybrids of Paleolithic caves, half human, half beast, etched in pigment. The zigzags and dots, the swirling patterns, all recur in both traditions. Neuroscience may explain them as visions of the brain in altered states, but within culture, they are voices of spirit, signs of journeys inward and beyond. The caves of Europe, once thought mute, suddenly speak when placed beside these living voices. The Arctic adds another layer. Shamans among Inuit and Siberian peoples speak of caves, cracks, and tunnels as entrances to the other world. Their drums echo in the dark, guiding journeys into realms where ancestors and animals dwell together. To stand before a painted chamber in France and imagine drums, chants, and echoes is not far from what Arctic shamans still describe today. The cave is not only shelter, but threshold, a doorway to other realities. The voices of stone are the voices of worlds overlapping, of the living and the dead, of the seen and the unseen. These beliefs are not relics of superstition, but systems of meaning that carried humanity through ice and hunger. Even the use of ochre persists. In burials from South Africa to Siberia, from Australia to the Americas, red pigment coats bones and grave goods, just as in Ice Age Europe. The color, bright as blood, binds the living and the dead across continents. It is astonishing to realize that a people in one hemisphere, 10,000 miles from another, reached for the same mineral, ground it into powder, and sprinkled it over their dead. The universality suggests not only coincidence, but a deep human impulse. The red of ochre is the voice of the earth itself, speaking through burial, through painting, through ritual. When archaeologists brush sediment from ochre-stained bones, they are not uncovering an isolated custom, but tapping into a flood of continuity that still flows today. Some might argue these parallels are illusion, that modern traditions cannot speak for ancient ones. But the resonances are too strong to ignore. The images of the San and Aboriginal peoples are not copies of Paleolithic caves. They are independent expressions of the same human relationship to land and spirit. They remind us that our ancestors were not alien, not incomprehensible, but participants in the same dialogue that continues wherever humans live close to Earth. Their voices are not locked in stone. They are still audible in song, in ritual, in pigment brushed on rock by hands that know the same gestures. Modern archaeologists often turn to ethnography, not to impose meaning, but to listen. When elders speak of animals as kin, of art as communication with spirit, of caves as wombs of transformation, we begin to hear the whispers in Paleolithic chambers with new ears. The voices of stone grow clearer when set beside living traditions. The resonance is not proof of identical beliefs, but a reminder that human imagination has always moved along certain currents, that the impulse to seek meaning beyond the visible world is as old as the handprints pressed into rock. This continuity also changes how we see ourselves. The caves are not museums of lost humanity, but mirrors of enduring humanity. The San, the Aboriginal peoples, the Inuit, these are not representatives of the past, but of the present, bearers of traditions that stretch across millennia. Their voices enrich the voices of stone, reminding us that art and ritual are not separate from survival, but inseparable from it. To live is to inscribe meaning, to speak with the world, to paint and chant an echo in darkness. That truth is as alive today as it was in the Ice Age. To stand in a painted cave is to feel surrounded by voices, not silent, but layered, a chorus of human imagination. The bison gallop, the horses leap, the hands reach, and the dots whisper patterns. These are not mute relics, but voices of ancestors, of spirit, of continuity. And when we look outward to modern traditions that still paint, still chant, still use ochre to bind the living and the dead, we realize the chorus never stopped. The voices of stone are still speaking, if we know how to listen. At some point, the walls grew quiet. The last torches sputtered. The last hand pressed pigment against stone. The last animal leapt into life beneath firelight, and then no more. The tradition of painting in the deep chambers faded, its silence as mysterious as its beginning. For thousands of years, people had entered the caves, generation after generation, layering images upon images, singing into echoes, scattering ochre over stone. And then, gradually, the practice stopped. The caves remained, but the voices of their painters fell silent. We can never know the moment, never name the final artist who blew pigment across a hand, who dipped fingers into ochre, who stood back and saw their vision glow in firelight. Yet archaeology gives us faint clues, fragile as smoke, about the twilight of the painters. Dating techniques reveal that some of the last known cave paintings in Europe were created around 15 to 18,000 years ago, long after the first hands had been pressed onto walls. The tradition endured through millennia of climate change, of glacial retreat and advance, of migrations and extinctions. But by the time the glaciers withdrew, leaving forests where tundra once stretched, the cave art ceased. The reasons are not simple. Perhaps the world itself changed. New landscapes offering different sanctuaries. New rituals shifting away from the underground. Perhaps communities no longer felt the same bond with deep chambers. Once herds of mammoths and bison began to vanish, replaced by forests filled with red deer and boar. The old animals, painted again and again, were disappearing, and with them, perhaps the power of painting itself. To create a bison on the wall, when the bison no longer roamed, may have felt like speaking to ghosts, voices too faint to answer. Traces of fire in late layers tell part of the story. Hearths still burned at cave mouths, people still sheltered in shallows, but the deep chambers show less soot, fewer torch smears. It is as though the journeys inward grew rarer, the rituals less frequent, until only echoes remained. The walls show unfinished figures, animals left half-formed, lines broken off mid-gesture. Were they abandoned rituals, or did painters never return to finish? The silence of the caves absorbs these questions, giving no answer. Archaeologists record pigments layered thinly over old paintings, but the layers end suddenly, as if the brush was dropped and never lifted again. The last painters were still there, still reaching, and then they were gone. One possibility is that rituals moved outward, away from the dark and into the open. Rock shelters and cliffs bear paintings of later ages, more exposed to wind and rain, more visible to communities gathered beneath the sky. The caves, secretive and hidden, may have been abandoned in favor of open places where the land itself became the canvas. In this transition, we see continuity and change, the desire to inscribe meaning still alive but transformed. The voices of stone did not end. They shifted tone, carrying their resonance into new landscapes. Yet the deep caves, sealed in shadow, became tombs of silence. their last paintings left untouched for millennia until rediscovered by modern eyes. There is another possibility, too. That belief itself shifted. Rituals tied to animals and spirits of the hunt may have yielded to new cosmologies, new ways of understanding life and death. As societies adapted to changing environments, their myths and practices must have adapted too. What once required the womb of stone may have been carried out in fields, forests, or in rituals we can no longer trace. The last painters may not have abandoned art, but transformed it, carrying pigment and story into forms that left fewer traces. We glimpse fragments, carved figurines, beads, ornaments, but the great animals on cave walls stand as the final monuments of a tradition whose roots we can only guess. The melancholy of this ending is heightened by its invisibility. There was no final performance, no closing act. The silence fell slowly, unnoticed, until centuries passed without new pigment. The caves became empty chambers, their echoes unbroken, their fires cold. Perhaps children once wandered inside and saw fading animals, their colors dimmed, their power no longer recognized. Perhaps elders spoke of times when the walls were alive, stories that faded with each retelling until memory dissolved into myth. The caves became haunted not by spirits, but by absence. Spaces where once humanity had spoken with stone, and now only silence remained. And yet the paintings themselves endured. Protected by darkness, sheltered from weather, they waited. For thousands of years they lingered unseen, invisible to all but bats and the slow drip of water. The last painters could not have imagined that one day strangers would crawl into those same chambers with electric lights and cameras, brushing away sediment to reveal their work anew. They painted for spirits, for kin, for themselves, but their images survived for us. The silence of their disappearance was not the end, only an interlude. The voices they pressed into stone still speak, even if the painters themselves vanished into time. Archaeology adds fragments of poignancy. In some caves, calcite deposits have grown over paintings, thin veils of stone sealing them like glass. To uncover them is to peel back time itself, revealing colors as fresh as the day they were blown. Elsewhere, bones lie scattered in the same chambers, reminders that life and death walked hand in hand with art. Sometimes a painting is found above a burial, the two acts inseparable even at the end. These juxtapositions suggest that the last painters did not simply abandon their traditions, but wove them into new forms, carrying their meanings outward into different rituals. The silence of the caves was not a void, but a transition. Still, the sense of loss lingers. To know that the voices of stone fell quiet is to feel the fragility of culture. What seems eternal can vanish in a generation, traditions dissolving like breath in cold air. The last painter, whoever they were, could not have known they were closing a chapter of humanity. They simply pressed their hand, painted an animal, sang into the echoes, as countless had before. And yet that gesture became the final one, the last thread in a tapestry woven for millennia. Their silence is our silence, their absence our inheritance. We stand in their caves and feel both gratitude and grief, knowing that what ended there will never return, except as memory. But perhaps the voices did not end at all. Perhaps they transformed, echoing through other traditions, carried by other pigments, whispered in stories that survived, though the walls grew still. The red flood flowed onward, even if not into deep caves. The hands continued to press, the songs continued to rise, the spirits continued to be invoked. What ended in stone lived on in flesh, in ritual, in memory. The last painters may have left the caves, but they did not leave humanity. Their silence is not absence, but continuity, hidden in forms we can no longer trace, but still feel. For tens of thousands of years, the caves slept. Their walls, alive with galloping bison and handprints, lay hidden in darkness, untouched by human eyes. Fires burned out, entrances collapsed, forests grew above them. Generations passed, empires rose and fell, and still the animals waited in silence. Then by chance, the walls began to speak again. A shepherd boy stumbled into Lascaux in 1940, chasing a dog into a hole, and the beam of his lantern revealed horses leaping in ochre across stone. A century earlier, a hunter at Altamira had discovered similar visions, dismissed at the time as forgeries because no one believed primitive humans capable of such artistry. One by one, the caves emerged from silence, and modern eyes gazed upon the same images that firelight had once animated. What had been buried for millennia leapt into the light again, as if no time had passed at all. The rediscovery of the caves changed not only archaeology, but our idea of ourselves. For centuries, humanity imagined its ancestors as crude, brutish, living in shadows without imagination. But the paintings shattered that illusion. Here were masterpieces, not scribbles, horses with shading, bison with movement, stags whose antlers spanned entire ceilings. Here were compositions that required planning, perspective, and an eye for beauty. Suddenly, the caveman was no longer a caricature, but an artist, a maker of meaning. The caves forced us to reconsider what it meant to be human, to see creativity not as a recent invention, but as an inheritance stretching back tens of millennia. Science soon joined wonder. Radiocarbon dating, developed in the mid-20th century, gave the first clear estimates of age, revealing that the paintings were not thousands, but tens of thousands of years old. Later refinements pushed the dates further, some hand stencils reaching back 40,000 years, nearly to the edge of modern humanity's arrival in Europe. Pigment analysis showed that ochre came from quarries miles away, carried deliberately into the caves. Microscopic studies revealed layers of application, some images repainted generations apart, proving that the caves were not one-time acts, but rituals repeated over centuries. Forensic methods applied to hand stencils revealed who painted them: women, adolescents, elders, expanding our sense of community within those walls. Each discovery pulled the paintings closer, making them less mysterious, but more human. Technology has allowed us to listen as well as look. Acoustic studies measured echoes in painted chambers, confirming that the places with the strongest resonance often held the richest art. Theories of ritual singing and drumming gained support not from speculation, but from measurable data, the caves themselves revealing their voices. Digital scans recreated the walls in 3 dimensions, showing how firelight would have flickered across uneven surfaces, animating the beasts. Some reconstructions even project torchlight onto virtual models, and modern viewers gasp as painted horses seem to run again, their legs shifting in shadow, their bodies moving as if alive. The screen becomes the torch. The laboratory becomes the cave. In this way, the story moves from stone to screen, from pigment on rock to pixels glowing in the dark. Archaeologists treat these spaces as time capsules. Every detail is recorded. soot marks on ceilings, fingerprints pressed into soft clay, fragments of torches discarded in corners. Forensic science can even identify the type of wood burned, the order of strokes in a painting, the sequence of visits to a chamber. Chemical analysis distinguishes pigments mixed with fat from those mixed with saliva, hinting at different techniques or purposes. Each fragment is a clue, a whisper from the past. The caves are studied like crime scenes, every trace preserved, every possibility considered. And yet behind the science, the awe remains. Even the most rigorous researcher admits the feeling of stepping into a sacred place, of standing in firelight's echo while holding modern instruments. The stone resists reduction. It insists on mystery. Some of the discoveries are heartbreakingly fragile. When Lascaux was first opened to tourists, the breath of visitors, their heat and moisture, began to damage the walls. Fungi bloomed, pigments faded, the ancient animals threatened by modern presence. Conservationists rushed to close the cave, building replicas where visitors could marvel without endangering the original. Today, high-resolution scans and 3D models allow anyone with a screen to wander the chambers virtually, to zoom into details once reserved for those who risked crawling into narrow tunnels. The paintings have moved from torchlight to electric light, from stone to screen, accessible to billions, yet vulnerable to none. In this transformation lies both triumph and loss. Triumph that the art endures, loss that we can never truly see it as the painters did, in flickering firelight, in ritual, in hunger and hope. The bones uncovered in the same caves speak alongside the paintings. Forensic reconstruction of skeletons reveals the faces of those who might have pressed hands against walls. CT scans of skulls show old wounds healed, teeth worn by grit, joints worn by walking. DNA recovered from tiny fragments links them to us directly, confirming that the painters are not strangers but ancestors, carrying the same genetic threads that weave into our own bodies. Science bridges the distance not only with images, but with bloodlines. When we stare at the paintings, we are staring not at others, but at ourselves. Voices of kin speaking from stone. Even pigments are given voices by modern methods. Spectroscopy identifies the exact minerals used, tracing them back to quarries. Some ochres came from places more than 100 kilometers away, meaning that pigment was valued enough to be carried across landscapes, traded, or transported during migration. In this way, a single patch of red on a wall carries the memory of a journey, a fragment of land carried into the cave and transformed into symbol. To analyze pigment today is to trace paths across ice and forest, to map human movement as surely as footprints do. The science is precise, but its implications are poetic. The world itself was gathered, ground, and pressed into memory. The caves are now among the most carefully guarded places on Earth. Sensors monitor temperature and humidity. Access is restricted to protect fragile pigments. Some researchers enter only once a year, others never at all. And yet through screens, through scans, the art is more widely seen than ever before. The paintings, once hidden for tens of millennia, are now part of global memory. Children in cities can see them on tablets. Scholars on other continents can analyze them without leaving their desks. The voices of stone have been translated into pixels, and their reach is greater than ever. From stone to screen, the story has changed form, but not meaning. The animals still leap, the hands still reach, The echoes still resound, and yet something remains untranslatable. No screen can reproduce the smell of damp earth, the pressure of silence, the chill of stone, the trembling of torchlight. No simulation can carry the weight of crouching in darkness where ancient people once stood, pressing their hands into pigment, whispering chants into the echo. Science reveals much, but the essence remains elusive, as if the caves keep one secret for themselves. We may map every pigment grain, scan every contour, reconstruct every footprint, but we cannot recapture the heartbeat of those moments. The voices of stone speak across millennia, but they do not speak entirely. They remind us that knowledge and mystery must coexist, that to understand fully is to risk silence. From stone to screen, from firelight to electricity, from pigment to pixel, the journey of cave art is a story of endurance. The last painters vanished, but their work remains, carried into our own world by science and imagination. When we look at the images on our screens, we are part of the same chain, observers in light, trying to hear voices across darkness. The caves endure because they carry not only images, but meaning, and meaning flows forward, adapting to each age. The screen is only the newest surface, the latest wall on which the voices of stone find resonance. They speak still, not only from caves, but from the devices in our hands, from the knowledge in our books, from the awe in our silence. The flood has not ended. It has changed form. And we are now the keepers of the voices, charged with carrying them onward into the future. The last step into the cave is always into silence. But it is a silence that is not empty. The walls are covered with voices, the handprints reaching out like echoes of breath that never fades. When we look at them now, through the lenses of science and imagination, we realize that we are not outsiders gazing at strangers. We are their descendants, their inheritors, their continuity. The hands, pressed in pigment, are not only theirs, but ours, stretched across 40,000 years, asking us to remember. We are their hands, reaching back as much as forward, carrying their stories, whether we choose to or not. Every detail we have uncovered, from bones cracked for marrow to beads buried with children, from the echoes of chants to the stenciled hands of women and adolescents, reminds us that humanity has always been more than survival. Hunger shaped them, predators hunted them, winters starved them, yet still they painted. Still they buried their dead with ochre. Still they carried shells from distant seas to place around the neck of a child who would never grow old. These gestures were not necessary to stay alive, but they were necessary to remain human. The hands on the walls are proof that meaning mattered as much as meat, that the imagination was as vital as fire. Science has peeled away some of the mystery, dating pigments, tracing ochre quarries, analyzing bite marks on bones, scanning chambers in 3 dimensions. Yet the mystery is not diminished, but deepened. The more we learn, the more we feel the enormity of their vision. They lived in a world of danger and loss, but they carried into it a creativity that still astonishes. Their images are not random. They are deliberate, layered, repeated. They are testimony that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit insisted on beauty, insisted on memory. We cannot help but hear the call in these gestures. Live not only to endure, but to create, to connect, to reach across time. The caves remind us that the line between us and them is thinner than we imagine. Press your palm against stone and it aligns with theirs. Listen in silence and you hear your own breath, echo just as theirs did. Watch firelight flicker, and you see the same shadows they saw, animals leaping, hands glowing. There is no gulf of difference, only continuity. We share the same bodies, the same fears, the same longing to belong. They were not lesser versions of us. They were us, in an earlier chapter, writing the first words of a story that continues in our own gestures, our own marks, our own voices. To call their work primitive is to misunderstand. Primitive is what endures, what lies at the root, what carries forward. Their art is primal, yes, but primal in the sense of foundation, of beginning. Without their hands, there would be no canvases, no cathedrals, no screens filled with images. The line that stretches from ochre on stone to pixels in light is unbroken. The flood of red has carried us to this moment, and we carry it still, whether we acknowledge it or not. Every time we write our names, every time we sign with our hands, every time we reach outward to declare, "I am here," we are repeating their gesture. We are their hands, still pressing pigment into the walls of time. The tenderness in their world lingers in ours. The healed fractures and skeletons remind us that compassion is ancient. The burials covered in ochre remind us that mourning is as old as breath. The handprints of children remind us that even the smallest lives were given meaning. These are not foreign customs, but familiar ones, resonating in the way we still gather, still bury, still care, still paint. Their humanity is not distant. It is continuous, woven into our own. To see them clearly is to see ourselves more honestly, to recognize that imagination and care have always been our companions, just as hunger and death have always been our adversaries. The caves endure as teachers. They show us what is permanent, not the bodies that crumble, not the fires that fade, but the marks we choose to leave. The hands and animals still speak because they were pressed into permanence, chosen over silence, carried into stone. They are reminders that we too will vanish, that our bodies will dissolve into dust. What endures are the gestures we make, the care we give, the art we leave, the memory we shape. We are their hands, and we too will be hands to those who come after. What we press into our own walls, be they books, screens, or stories, will one day be their inheritance. When archaeologists brush dust from a handprint, when light falls across a painting unseen for millennia, there is always a pause, a breath of awe. In that moment, time collapses. The wall is not 40,000 years away, but immediate, present, alive. The hand on the wall is your hand. The breath in pigment is your breath. This is the gift of the caves, to remind us that humanity is not a sequence of separate ages, but a single unfolding story. The voices of stone are our voices, their silence our silence, their persistence our persistence. We are the last chapter they could not write. Their hands reached as far as stone, ours reach into light. They left their marks in caves. We leave ours in books, in images, in memory. Yet the gesture is the same. We are their hands, still pressing outward, still insisting on presence against the tide of time. To stand before their walls is to feel the weight of inheritance and the urgency of responsibility. We cannot let their voices fade. They painted so we would remember. It is for us to listen, to carry, to honor. The caves close in silence, but they do not close in emptiness. The hands remain, red against stone, forever reaching. They remind us that meaning is never wasted, that imagination is never lost, that even in darkness, humanity will find a way to speak. We are their hands. And in every mark we make, every story we tell, every memory we preserve, they live again.